About the Janitor, tell me. The most expensive aircraft in the hangar wasn't going anywhere, and the most powerful woman in the building was about to lose everything she had spent 20 years building. Not to a rival, not to a boardroom betrayal, but to a hairline fault buried so deep inside a pressurization system that 3 certified engineers had already missed it twice. What happened next in that hangar would change both their lives forever. If you're watching this right now, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you stay until the end, I promise you it's worth it. Hit that like button and let's get into it. The hangar at Crestfield Aviation smelled the way all serious hangars do. Jet fuel and cold metal and something else underneath. Something harder to name. Tension, maybe. Or money. Sometimes those two things have the same smell. It was 4:53 in the morning. The fluorescent overheads hummed at a frequency that made the back of your teeth ache if you stood under them long enough, and the ground crew had been standing under them for going on 2 hours already. 3 of them were clustered near the tail section of the Whitmore G700, clipboards in hand, coffee untouched, speaking in the low, clipped voices that professionals use when they don't want to admit they're out of ideas. The Whitmore G700. $12 million of aerospace engineering sitting on its landing gear like a piece of sculpture, white and clean and utterly grounded. Vivian Sterling walked through the side entrance at 4:55, and the temperature in the hangar seemed to drop by 2 degrees. She was 51 years old, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse the color of storm clouds, and she moved the way people move when they've spent 2 decades making rooms pay attention to them. Her assistant, Marcus, trailed half a step behind her, phone already in hand, already pulling up the morning's damage. "Talk to me," she said, not breaking stride, not looking at the aircraft yet. She looked at the engineers. The senior engineer, a heavy-set man named Dale Forsyth, stepped forward. He had the expression of someone who had practiced what he was about to say and still wasn't happy with any version of it. "We have a pressurization issue, Ms. Sterling. We caught it during the pre-departure check about 90 minutes ago. Sensor anomaly in the cabin pressure monitoring system. We've been running diagnostics since. Can you fix it before 6? A beat. A very long beat. "No, ma'am." Vivian stopped walking. She finally looked at the aircraft. "How long?" Dale shifted his weight. "Realistically, we're looking at pulling the affected component, sourcing a replacement. The G700's pressurization hardware isn't exactly off the shelf, so we'd need to get a part flown in from the manufacturer's service center in... How long, Dale?" 2 days. Maybe 3 if the part has to clear customs. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was the silence of something breaking quietly, the way a hairline fracture spreads through glass before anyone notices. Vivian turned to Marcus. "Get Hendricks on the phone. It's almost 5 in the morning in Tokyo." "I'm aware what time it is in Tokyo. Get him on the phone." She turned back to the aircraft and stood there studying it with an expression that was impossible to read. Behind her, the ground crew traded glances. Someone's radio crackled softly and was immediately silenced. The deal that Vivian Sterling was trying to get to Tokyo for had a name: the Haramoto acquisition. 41 months of negotiation compressed into a single closing window. 72 hours during which Kenji Haramoto and his board would be in the same room, willing to sign. Haramoto Technology was not a company you could circle back to. Kenji Haramoto was 73 years old, famously private, famously impatient, and he had canceled 2 previous negotiations with other firms simply because he had decided he didn't like the people across the table from him. Vivian had spent 18 months becoming someone he liked. She had learned enough Japanese to open meetings in his language. She had studied his company's history, its engineering philosophy, its corporate culture, back to its founding. She had flown to Tokyo 4 times in the past year just for dinners, not meetings. Dinners, because that was how Haramoto worked, and Vivian was smart enough to work that way too. The merger would be valued at $380 million. It would complete the vertical integration of her company, Sterling Dynamics, giving her access to precision sensor technology that would make her aerospace components division untouchable for the next decade. She had one shot at the closing table. The jet was supposed to leave at 6:15 p.m. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "Hendricks is asking if you can push the initial meeting by 6 hours. Says he can..." Tell him no. She didn't look up from her phone. If I'm not in that room by 3 o'clock Tokyo time, Kenji will interpret it as disrespect. He'll have spent the morning deciding we weren't serious. I know how his mind works. There's a commercial option, Marcus said carefully. There's a Japan Airlines flight leaving O'Hare at 7:40 that connects through. That puts me in Tokyo at 11 the next morning. The window closes at midnight. I know. So that doesn't work. I know, Marcus said again. I'm sorry. I'm just... Stop apologizing and start thinking. She pulled up a charter search on her phone and started working through it, though she already knew what she'd find. Short-notice intercontinental charters at 5 in the morning were a different category of problem than most people understood. It wasn't just the aircraft. It was the crew certification, the flight plan, the slot times, the fuel stops. You couldn't manufacture any of those things faster than they were designed to move. Across the hangar, Dale Forsyth had gathered his team around one of the maintenance tablets and was going through the diagnostic readout again. 2 junior techs flanked him. A third engineer, a woman named Priya Sanchez, who'd been with Crestfield for 6 years, was on the phone with the manufacturer's tech line, reciting fault codes into the receiver in a monotone. They were all trying. Vivian could see that. It didn't help. The hangar had a utility corridor that ran along the north wall behind the equipment bays. It was the kind of space that exists in every large building, necessary, undecorated, populated by rolling carts and folded tarps, and the institutional smell of industrial cleaner. At 5 o'clock in the morning, one person was in it. His name was Ethan Mercer, and he was pushing a mop bucket. He was 44 years old, with the build of someone who had once been athletic and had stopped caring about it without fully losing it. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a face that had been, at some point, expressive and quick, and was now mostly quiet. He wore the gray uniform of the Crestfield maintenance staff, the kind of uniform that turns you invisible in any room you walk into, which was, in its way, exactly what he needed it to do. He moved the bucket to the next section of corridor and stopped. Through the gap in the equipment bay door, he had a partial sightline into the main hangar floor. He could see the Whitmore G700 from about 60 feet away. He could see the ground crew gathered underneath it. He could see one of the techs, the woman on the phone, with her maintenance tablet tilted at an angle that put the display facing roughly in his direction. He couldn't read the numbers from here. He didn't need to. He recognized the aircraft by its tail number. He recognized the maintenance posture, the specific location of the access panels they'd opened, the particular cluster of diagnostic equipment they'd deployed around the nose gear bay. He recognized the shape of the problem, the way a doctor recognizes a familiar illness from across a crowded waiting room before the chart, before the conversation, just from the way someone is sitting. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the mop handle. Then he pushed the bucket to the next section and kept moving. At 5:22, Priya Sanchez ended her call with the manufacturer's tech line and walked to where Dale Forsyth was standing. They're recommending a full component pull, she said. The pressure management unit, the secondary valve assembly, the associated wiring harness. They say the fault code pattern we're seeing is consistent with a failed unit, and there's no patch protocol they're comfortable authorizing. That's what I thought they'd say. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. Okay, I need to call this. I'm going to go tell Ms. Sterling we're looking at replacement parts and a 2-day minimum. She's not going to like that. I know she's not going to like that, but I'm not going to clear an aircraft I'm not confident in. He said it firmly, and Priya nodded, because that was the right answer, even if it was going to be an ugly conversation. Dale crossed the hangar floor toward where Vivian was standing with Marcus and 2 other members of her executive team who had arrived in the last 20 minutes. He was about 10 feet away from her when a voice came from somewhere behind him. It's not the pressure management unit. Everyone turned. The maintenance worker was standing at the edge of the hangar floor, just where the equipment corridor met the main space. He had a mop in his hand. He looked at first glance like someone who had wandered into the wrong room. Dale stared at him. Excuse me? The PMU, the man said. He spoke quietly and without particular urgency, the way someone speaks when they're used to being certain about things. That's not your problem. You'll pull it, you'll test it, it'll come back fine. You'll have wasted a day and a half and you'll be right back where you are now. A beat of complete silence. Then Dale said, Who are you? I'm the night janitor. He paused. But I know that aircraft. Vivian Sterling, who had heard the exchange from 6 feet away, turned to look at him directly for the first time. What did you say? She asked. The next 4 minutes were not comfortable. Dale Forsyth had 22 years of aircraft maintenance certification, a wall of credentials, and the reasonable conviction that the man holding the mop handle was not a resource he needed to be consulting at 5:30 in the morning. He said as much, not unkindly but clearly, and the janitor didn't argue with him. He just waited. It was Vivian who kept the conversation open. She'd spent 2 decades in rooms where the person with the least official authority sometimes turned out to be the only one who had actually read the contract. She'd learned not to dismiss quiet certainty too quickly. Walk me through it, she said to him. What do you think you're seeing? The maintenance worker, she still didn't know his name yet, looked at her steadily. What fault codes are you pulling? Dale made a sound that might have been a protest, but Vivian held up one hand without looking at him, and he stopped. Priya, who was standing nearby with the tablet, glanced at Dale. He gave her a small, unhappy nod. She read off the fault codes. The maintenance worker listened without moving. When she finished, he said, E7, E9, and the E14 cascade. Yes. That pattern looks like a PMU failure. It's not. It's a thermal calibration error in the secondary pressure loop. The E14 isn't a downstream effect of the E7. It's actually the origin point. The sensor isn't bad. The calibration is bad. It's reading a normal operating temperature as an anomaly and shutting down the loop as a precaution. Priya frowned. She looked down at her tablet, then back up. The calibration sequence would have been verified in the last scheduled maintenance, Dale said. His voice had shifted slightly, not angry, but tighter. We did a full systems check 3 weeks ago. Our people signed off on it. I know, the man said. The calibration was probably fine 3 weeks ago. Thermal calibration drift on the G700 secondary loop is sensitive to a specific set of operating conditions. High ambient humidity combined with repeated short-haul cycles over a compressed time period. If this aircraft has been doing a lot of short domestic legs in the past 2 weeks, in humid weather, you'd see exactly this drift pattern. The sensor thinks it's failing. It's not. Another silence. A longer one. Vivian looked at Marcus. Pull the flight logs for the last 2 weeks. On it. She looked back at the maintenance worker. What's your name? A pause, as if the question were slightly more complicated than it appeared. Ethan, he said. Ethan Mercer. Ethan, she studied him. How do you know this aircraft? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I helped write the FAA repair procedure for the secondary pressure loop thermal calibration fault on the G700 series, about 9 years ago, when I was still... He stopped. When I was doing other work. Marcus came back with the tablet in under 3 minutes. 11 flights in 14 days, he said, 7 of them under 2 hours. Mostly East Coast runs, humid weather the whole stretch. Vivian looked at Dale Forsyth. Dale looked at Ethan Mercer. The engineer in Dale, the part that had 2 decades of honest technical work behind it, was already running the logic. He didn't want to run it, because if the logic held, it meant he'd been about to recommend pulling a perfectly functional component and waiting 2 days for a replacement that the aircraft didn't need. That was a hard thing to sit with, but he ran it anyway because that was his job. If you're right about the calibration drift, he said carefully, the fix would require access to the pressure loop's secondary control module in a recalibration sequence that... He paused. That's not a standard field procedure. Most techs don't carry that in their certification profile. I know, Ethan said. The procedure requires familiarity with the G700's proprietary loop architecture. There are about 30 certified engineers in the country who've done it hands-on. I've done it 11 times. You were an aerospace engineer, Vivian said. It wasn't quite a question. Yes. And now I work here. He said it without embarrassment, without apology. Just stated it as a fact, the way you state all facts. Vivian Sterling had not gotten to where she was by ignoring inconvenient information. She had also not gotten there by being reckless. She looked at this man. The gray uniform, the mop handle he was still holding, the completely unrattled quality of him, and made the kind of calculation she was best at. "If you're wrong," she said, "I lose the aircraft for 2 days and the deal is dead. Where does that leave me?" "Same place you are right now," Ethan said. "You're already looking at 2 days if you go with the PMU replacement. And if you're right, you leave before 6. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Dale. "Give him whatever he needs." As Dale Forsyth was not a graceful man in defeat, but he was a professional. He directed his 2 junior techs to pull the access panel on the nose gear bay and set up the secondary control module interface. He pulled the G700's technical manual archive and found the relevant section. He stood back and watched as Ethan Mercer set down the mop handle, washed his hands at the utility sink on the hangar wall, and walked to the aircraft. The way Ethan moved when he approached the jet was different from how he moved with the mop. Not dramatically different, not a transformation, just the weight of him shifted. He walked like someone returning to a place he knew. He crouched at the access panel and looked at the secondary control module for a long moment without touching anything. Priya handed him the diagnostic interface cable without being asked, which meant she'd already decided she believed him, or at least believed him enough to see where this went. "Thank you," he said. He plugged in. The hangar was quieter than it had been for hours. Even the fluorescents seemed to hum at a lower frequency. Marcus had stepped outside to make calls. Vivian remained standing about 15 feet back from the aircraft, watching. She watched because she'd learned that you could tell a great deal about whether a person knew what they were doing by watching them work when they thought no one was evaluating them. Ethan Mercer was not performing. That was the first thing she noticed. He wasn't explaining his moves or glancing up to see if anyone was impressed. He worked the interface with the focused economy of someone who had done this specific task many times. Not rushing, not hesitating, navigating through menu layers that she could see on the secondary display without the slight pauses of someone who was reconstructing a half-remembered process. He knew exactly where he was going. Dale drifted closer, despite himself. He watched over Ethan's shoulder for a while, following the calibration readouts. "You're pulling the baseline reference point first," Dale said. Not critically, almost to himself. "You have to establish where it thinks it is before you can tell it where it actually is," Ethan said, not looking up. "If you try to reset the target value without addressing the reference drift, you'll just get a new set of fault codes 20 minutes later." "Right." Dale watched for another moment. "Walk me through the reference anchor step." Ethan talked while he worked, and the voice that came out when he was explaining something technical was a slightly different voice than the one he used for everything else. Cleaner, more precise. The voice of someone who had spent years teaching this material before he stopped. Priya was taking notes. She wasn't hiding the fact. One of the junior techs, a kid named Roberto, who'd been with Crestfield for 8 months, and who had been too intimidated to say anything for the past hour, edged closer and asked a question about the fault code cascade logic that was so specific it surprised everybody, including himself. Ethan answered it fully, without condescension, and Roberto nodded and stepped back. The time was 5:48. Vivian had stepped away to make her own call, pacing the length of the hangar wall. Marcus watched her from 20 feet away. She was on with her operations director, running contingency logistics. Not because she'd given up, but because Vivian Sterling always ran contingencies. It was a discipline. You hope for one outcome and you plan for 3 others, not because you're a pessimist, but because you respect the fact that the world doesn't care about your preferences. "If we're wheels up by 6:15, what's our buffer?" she said into the phone. "We can absorb about 40 minutes of delay and still make your 3 o'clock window," her operations director said. "Anything beyond that and we're gambling on Haramoto's goodwill." "He doesn't have goodwill. He has punctuality as a personal value system." "Then we need to be wheels up by 6:15. She looked at the clock on the hangar wall. It was 5:51. She ended the call and walked back toward the aircraft. At 6:04, Ethan Mercer ran the verification sequence. The secondary pressure loop ran its diagnostic cycle. The cabin pressure monitoring system came online. The fault codes, E7, E9, E14, all of them, cleared from the display. The system reported nominal. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Priya Sanchez looked at her tablet, back at the display, and said very quietly, That's a clean read. Dale Forsyth had his arms crossed. He uncrossed them. He stepped forward and looked at the readout himself. Run it again, he said. Ethan ran it again. Clean. One more time. Third pass, the same result. Every parameter in range, every sensor reporting nominal. The secondary pressure loop was calibrated correctly, operating correctly, and the system that 30 minutes ago was grounding a $12 million aircraft was now indistinguishable from a system that had never had a problem, without replacing a single component. Dale stood there for a long moment. Then he said, I need to call the FAA duty inspector for sign-off. You need to do it in the next 8 minutes, Vivian said. I know what I need to do, Ms. Sterling. He walked away with his phone already in hand. His voice, when he got the inspector on the line, was calm and professional and gave no indication of the particular shape this morning had taken. Vivian walked to where Ethan was closing up the access panel. You're done? She said. The aircraft is done. Dale still needs to sign off officially and get the FAA clearance. But the technical work is finished. Yes. She studied him. He was wiping down the diagnostic interface cable before handing it back, which was a small thing, but she noticed it. Who were you? She asked. Before. He handed the cable to Priya. He looked at Vivian. I was a principal engineer at Meridian Aerospace Systems, he said. I led the pressure systems team for 11 years. I wrote the maintenance protocols for 3 aircraft series, including the G700. I testified twice before the FAA Technical Advisory Board. He paused. I left about 5 years ago. Why? He didn't answer immediately. He looked past her, toward the hangar entrance, and something moved across his face. Not pain exactly, but the scar tissue over something that had been pain once. I had reasons, he said. She waited. He looked back at her. My wife died. My daughter was 1 year old. I had a choice between being the kind of engineer I used to be and being the kind of father she needed. I couldn't figure out how to do both. Vivian held that information for a moment. So you chose this, she said, not with judgment, as a fact. I chose her, he said. This is just what the rest of it looks like. Dale came back at 6:11. FAA duty inspector has reviewed the diagnostic logs and the calibration verification sequence. He's authorizing departure. He looked at Ethan. His expression was complicated, a man working through something in real time, trying to decide how to hold what had happened. You were right. About all of it. The procedure is in the documentation, Ethan said. Section 47 of the G700 maintenance supplement. It's been there since the aircraft series was certified. I know it's been there, Dale stopped. We didn't put it together correctly. The fault code pattern threw us. It's designed to look like a PMU failure, Ethan said. That's actually one of the things I flagged in the original write-up. The fault code pattern is misleading if you don't know to read the E14 as origin rather than downstream. He said it without edge, without told you so, just as technical information. Dale nodded slowly. I'm going to have my whole team read that section. That's a good idea. The 2 men looked at each other. Then Dale stuck out his hand. Ethan shook it. The crew was boarding. The Whitmore G700 was being prepped for pushback. The hangar, which had been a place of controlled panic 2 hours ago, was now a place of controlled departure. Vivian Sterling stood near the aircraft stairs with Marcus beside her, running the final checklist. Tokyo slot is confirmed, Marcus said. 3 o'clock local. We're going to make it. I know, she said. She was looking across the hangar at Ethan Mercer, who had picked his mop back up and was returning to the utility corridor. Tell him I'd like a word before I board, she said. Marcus went. Ethan came back. He stood in front of her and waited. I don't know what to say to you, she said, which is unusual for me. You don't need to say anything. I do, actually. She paused. What you did this morning, the technical work aside, you didn't have to say anything. You could have kept walking. Most people would have. He was quiet for a moment. I know what it's like to watch something fail when it doesn't have to, he said. It's a hard thing to walk past. She looked at him. She looked at the gray uniform, the quiet face, the complete absence of anything that wanted recognition from her. "I'm going to have my assistant send you something before we land," she said. "Not charity. I want to be clear about that. I don't do charity. I'm not asking for anything. I know you're not. That's why I want to." She picked up her bag. "The aviation industry lost something when you walked away from it, Mr. Mercer. Whatever reason you had, the industry is still carrying that loss. I hope you know that." He nodded once, slowly. "Safe flight," he said. She went up the stairs. Right. The aircraft pushed back from the hangar at 6:17. Ethan Mercer stood near the equipment bay and watched it go. The engine note changed as the G700 taxied toward the runway, and the sound moved through the hangar floor and up through the soles of his shoes, and he stood there and felt it. He had spent 5 years making himself invisible in rooms like this one. He had made a kind of peace with that, with what he gave up and what he kept. But peace isn't the same as comfort, and this morning had cracked something open just slightly, the way cold air comes through a window you forgot you'd left open. He thought about the calibration sequence. He thought about the look on Roberto's face when he'd answered the question. He thought about the way Dale Forsyth's voice had changed. Not toward him exactly, but toward the problem itself. The way an engineer's voice always changes when the right answer reveals itself. He thought about his daughter. He picked up the mop. He had 4 hours until his shift ended. Lily's daycare opened at 8, and he'd arranged to pick her up by 9. She had a thing about waffles on Wednesdays. This had been true for approximately 6 months and showed no signs of changing. And he'd promised her the ones with the strawberries this week, because last week they'd been out, and she'd been stoic about it in a way that made his chest ache. He pushed the bucket back to the corridor. The sound of the G700's engines was fading now, heading toward the runway. He worked. Outside, at the edge of the airport's access road, a small car was parked in the short-term lot. In the back seat, a 6-year-old girl with dark hair and her father's eyes was asleep against a rolled-up jacket, one hand clutching a small stuffed elephant named, inexplicably and with great conviction, Gerald. She was waiting for him, the way she always waited, with the uncomplicated patience of someone who has never had any reason to doubt that the person she's waiting for will come. The G700 lifted off the runway at 6:29, and Ethan heard it from inside the utility corridor without looking up. He knew the sound well enough to track the aircraft by ear, the pitch change as the gear retracted, the engine note settling into climb power, the way the sound thinned and then vanished into the low cloud cover that had been sitting over the airfield since midnight. He stood there with the mop handle in both hands and listened to it go until there was nothing left to hear. Then he kept working. The night shift at Crestfield Aviation ran until 7, and Ethan had 2 more sections of corridor to do before he could start the equipment check-in. It was methodical work, the kind that gave your hands something to do while your mind either settled or didn't. His usually settled. He'd found, over 5 years of this, that there was something honest about cleaning floors that he hadn't expected when he started. No ambiguity, no politics. The floor was dirty or it wasn't. You did the work or you didn't. The result was visible and immediate, and no one could argue about whether you'd done it correctly. He'd needed that for a while, the clarity of it. What he hadn't expected was this morning. He pushed the bucket around the corner into the last corridor section and found Dale Forsyth standing there, leaning against the wall with 2 cups of coffee from the break room machine. The engineer held one out without a word. Ethan looked at it, then he took it. "It's bad," Dale said. "The machine's been broken since February. The cup says it's Colombian blend, but it tastes like they filtered it through a gym sock. I've had worse." "I believe you." Dale wrapped both hands around his own cup. He had the look of a man who had been running on adrenaline for 2 hours and was just now beginning to feel the crash coming. "I owe you an apology." "You don't." "I do. I was dismissive. You were appropriately skeptical of someone you didn't know who showed up telling you your diagnosis was wrong." Ethan sipped the coffee. It was, as advertised, genuinely terrible. "That's not a flaw. That's your job." Dale was quiet for a moment. "Where were you before Meridian? You said 11 years on the pressure systems team." "I did my graduate work at MIT Aeronautical Engineering, Focus on pressurization and environmental control systems. Went straight to Meridian after. I was on the G700 certification team from the beginning of the program. He said it the way you recite facts that belong to someone you used to know. I worked with the FAA Technical Division for a while. Joint Project on Maintenance Protocol Standardization. That's where the G700 supplement came from. Dale let out a slow breath. You wrote the manual I've been referencing for 6 years. Parts of it. And you're mopping my floors. Ethan looked at him. Your floors needed mopping. It wasn't sarcastic. Dale seemed to understand that because he didn't take it as a joke. He just nodded, slowly, the way you nod when someone has said something you don't have a clean response to. Do you miss it? Dale asked. Ethan considered the question seriously. He didn't get asked it often, and he'd learned that the quick answer and the true answer were different things. The quick answer was no, and it was partly honest. The true answer was more complicated. There were things he missed the way you miss a version of yourself that no longer exists, which is not quite the same as missing the thing itself. I miss the problems, he said finally. I don't miss what came around the problems. The politics. The performance. The constant. He paused, choosing. In those environments, at that level, you spend a lot of energy on things that aren't the actual work. Managing perceptions. Positioning. The aircraft doesn't care about any of that. The aircraft just has a problem and needs it solved. He looked down at the cup. I got tired of the distance between what I was doing and what actually mattered. Dale nodded slowly. He understood that. Most engineers understood that, if they were honest. Your daughter, Dale said. How old? 6. That's a good age. Something shifted in Dale's face. I've got 3. 17, 15, and 9. The 9-year-old still thinks I'm interesting. The other 2 have figured out I'm just a person. Ethan smiled. It was a small smile, but it was real. They'll come back around. That's what my wife says. Dale finished his coffee and dropped the cup in the nearest bin. He looked at Ethan with an expression that was direct, slightly uncomfortable, and honest. I'm going to write up this morning in the maintenance log. Correctly. Your name goes in the record. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. I want to. What happened this morning, the diagnosis, the procedure, the fix, that's a technical event, and it goes in the record accurately, or it doesn't go in at all. He paused. There are people at Crestfield who should know who you are, starting with management. Ethan looked at him steadily. I appreciate that. You don't have to do anything with it. I just want you to know it's going in. He left, and Ethan stood in the corridor with the bad coffee for a moment longer before finishing the last section of floor. At 7:10, the day shift arrived. The day shift at Crestfield was louder, more populated, more caffeinated. People came in with headphones and breakfast sandwiches and the particular energy of people who had slept, which was a different energy entirely from those who hadn't. Ethan did his equipment check-in at the maintenance office window, signed off on the cleaning log, and changed out of his uniform in the staff locker room. His own clothes were unremarkable. Dark jeans, a gray thermal, work boots that had been good boots once and were now just boots. He had a small bag that he kept in his locker. The day's supplies for Lily, a change of clothes for her, a granola bar, and a juice box. The paperback he carried everywhere and never had enough time to actually read. He sat on the bench in the locker room for a minute before standing up. The adrenaline from this morning had been fading for a while, but now it was fully gone, and what replaced it was the familiar weight of the day ahead. Not a bad weight, just weight. He had the grocery run to do before pickup because they were out of the frozen waffles, and he'd promised. And the strawberries were a specific variety from a specific store because Lily had strong and well-reasoned opinions about strawberries. He had a call with the apartment's property management at 11 about the water heater that had been making a sound he didn't like. He had a stack of mail on the kitchen counter that he'd been ignoring for a week. He stood up. He walked through the hangar floor on his way out because the exit to the employee parking lot went that way, and the hangar was between him and the morning. The space was different now. Activity everywhere. A cargo aircraft being serviced at Bay 3, ground crew voices, equipment moving. Normal. The bay where the G700 had been was empty, already being swept down. One of the junior techs, Roberto, was near the tool crib doing inventory. He looked up when Ethan passed. Hey, Roberto said. Ethan stopped. Hey, that thing you explained, about the E14 being origin rather than downstream. I looked it up after, in the supplement. He held up his phone, the PDF open on the screen. It's right there in the notes section. I've read that supplement twice and I never registered it. It's easy to miss. It's written as a caveat, not as a primary diagnostic flag. I'm going to flag it to Dale. Suggest it should be in the pre-diagnostic checklist. Ethan looked at him. That's a good idea. Do that. Roberto nodded, then seemed to decide something. You were a real engineer, weren't you? Before. The phrasing was accidental and slightly awkward, and Roberto clearly knew it the moment it came out because his face shifted. I didn't mean... I know what you meant, Ethan said. He wasn't offended. Yes, I was. How come you... Roberto stopped himself this time, by choice. Go look at Section 7 of the supplement too, Ethan said. There's a related condition in the primary loop that has a similar diagnostic presentation. Different fix, but same logic. It'll come up eventually. Roberto looked at him for a moment, then nodded and looked back at his phone. Ethan walked out. The parking lot was gray and damp, the morning light the color of old dishwater. His car was a 9-year-old Honda that had survived several things he hadn't expected it to survive, including a fender encounter with a highway guardrail 18 months ago that had left a dent above the rear wheel arch he'd never gotten around to fixing. He didn't care about the dent. He cared that the heater worked, because winters in this part of the state were not forgiving, and he cared that it started reliably, which it did. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. His phone had 2 notifications. One was from the property management company, confirming the 11 o'clock call. One was from a number he didn't recognize, a text message that read, "This is Marcus Chen, assistant to Vivian Sterling. Ms. Sterling asked me to reach out. She'd like to speak with you when she's landed in Tokyo. Would you be willing to receive a call this afternoon?" No obligation. He read it twice. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket and started the car. The grocery store at 7:45 in the morning was a different place than the grocery store at any other time. The parking lot was almost empty. The lights inside were the same as always, but felt more honest somehow, the way they feel when they're not competing with daylight yet. The produce section was being restocked, and the woman doing the restocking moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it thousands of times, and Ethan passed through and found the strawberries and stood there looking at them. 2 varieties. He knew which ones Lily liked, the smaller ones, which she said were sweeter and was probably right about. He put them in the basket. He moved through the store with the list in his head because he'd stopped writing grocery lists some time ago. When you shop for 2 people and one of them has consistent preferences, the list becomes internal. Eggs because they were low. Bread, the specific kind with the yellow label. Milk, though they were probably fine for another day, but he'd check when he got home. The frozen waffles, the only brand she'd tolerate without a lengthy and spirited negotiation. He was in the frozen aisle when his phone rang. He looked at it. Unknown number, different from Marcus's. He almost let it go to voicemail. Then he answered. "Ethan Mercer?" A woman's voice, professional, brisk. "Yes. My name is Sandra Kowalski. I'm the Director of Maintenance Operations at Crestfield. Dale Forsyth filed his incident report about an hour ago. I've been reading it." He waited. "I'd like to meet with you today. Or this week, if today doesn't work." "Today is complicated," he said. He was holding a bag of frozen waffles. "I have my daughter." "I understand. Whenever works." A pause. "Mr. Mercer, what I'm reading in this report is, frankly, it's unusual. I've been in aviation maintenance management for 18 years, and this particular combination of circumstances is not something I encounter often." "The fix was standard procedure," he said. "It's documented." "The fix was standard procedure that 3 of my certified engineers missed at 5 in the morning, and that you identified correctly from 60 feet away through a gap in a door." Her voice was measured, not effusive. She was stating facts the same way he did. "What I want to do is have a conversation, not about what happened this morning specifically, about you." He looked at the frozen waffles in his hand. I can come in Thursday, he said. Thursday works. 9 o'clock? Yes. Good. I'll have the conference room. A brief pause. And Mr. Mercer, thank you for what you did this morning. Dale's report was very clear on what the alternative looked like. She ended the call. He put the waffles in the basket and stood there in the frozen aisle for a moment, feeling the cold air on his face, and thought about Thursday in a way he hadn't thought about anything work-related in a long time. He picked up Lily at 9:03. She was in the daycare's indoor play area when he arrived, sitting at a low table with two other children, engaged in what appeared to be a complex negotiation involving construction blocks and a stuffed giraffe. She looked up when she heard the door, and her face did the thing it always did, a change so immediate and total that it never stopped surprising him, this expression that was just entirely uncomplicated gladness. Daddy. She left the table without ceremony and walked to him, and he crouched down and she wrapped her arms around his neck, and he held her for a second longer than he usually allowed himself to in public, because it had been a morning. Hi, Lil. I saved you a block, she said into his shoulder. That was thoughtful. It's the blue one. It's the best one. Okay. She pulled back and looked at his face with the particular scrutiny of a 6-year-old who has decided she is old enough to read adults. Her eyes were her mother's eyes, a warm, light brown that looked almost gold in certain light. She had her mother's eyebrows too, the slightly skeptical set of them. You look tired, she said. I'm okay. Did something happen? I had a busy morning. She considered this. Then, is it waffle day? It's waffle day. With strawberries? With strawberries, the small ones. Her expression resolved into satisfaction. Okay. She took his hand. Can Gerald come? I told him we'd go somewhere. Gerald was in the car last night. He's been there all morning. He doesn't mind. He likes the car. She was walking them toward the door, entirely confident that these logistics would be resolved in her favor. He told me. Gerald talks now. He's always talked. You just don't listen right. Gerald was, as reported, in the back seat, exactly where Lily had left him. He was a stuffed elephant with one ear that was darker than the other, from years of being held specifically by that ear, and he had an expression on his embroidered face that could be interpreted as either mild concern or deep contentment, depending on your mood when you looked at him. Ethan had, over the course of 6 years, developed a complicated relationship with Gerald, primarily because Lily expected him to treat Gerald as a participant in conversations, and he had found, gradually, that he did not actually mind doing this. Lily buckled herself in with the focused care she always brought to this task, checked Gerald's position, and then looked at the window as they pulled out. "What's the busy morning?" she asked. "An airplane had a problem. I helped fix it." She turned to look at him. "You fixed an airplane?" "I helped. The people there didn't know how to fix it exactly. I knew how." "Because you used to fix airplanes." "Because I used to fix them, yes." She thought about this for a block. Was it a big airplane? Pretty big. Did the people say thank you? He glanced in the rearview mirror at her. Some of them did. Good, she said, with the satisfied certainty of someone for whom this is the correct and obvious outcome. Then, Gerald wants to know what kind of airplane. It was a G700. A pause. Lily relayed this to Gerald in a murmur. Then, he says he doesn't know what that is. It's a private jet. Very nice one. The pressurization system had a thermal calibration drift in the secondary loop. Another pause, more murmuring. He says that sounds complicated. It's complicated if you've never seen it before. If you've done it 11 times, it's not. Lily looked at him with the kind of expression that meant she was deciding something about him. She did this periodically, made these quiet reassessments, like she was updating a mental file. He never knew exactly what was in those files, which seemed correct. She should get to keep some things private. 11 times is a lot, she said. It is. Are you going to fix more airplanes now? He kept his eyes on the road. Maybe. I don't know yet. Okay, she said. And then she turned back to the window because 6-year-olds have a clean capacity to accept incomplete answers that adults have mostly lost, and he loved her for it, without being able to say so in a way that would mean anything to her right now. The kitchen smelled like butter and the particular sweet smell that came from the waffle iron heating up. Lily was at the counter on the step stool she insisted on using because she considered herself a necessary part of the waffle operation, regardless of her actual contribution, which was primarily aesthetic. She was washing strawberries with more water than was strictly necessary. "How come you know how to fix things that other people don't know how to fix?" she asked. The question came from nowhere, which was where all her important questions came from. Ethan was watching the indicator light on the waffle iron. "I studied it for a long time, and then I did it for a long time. Both things together." "Like how I know all the dinosaur names?" "Exactly like that." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I know 42 dinosaur names." "I know." "Priya at daycare only knows 5. "She'll learn more." "Maybe." She set the colander of strawberries on the counter. "Daddy, do you miss fixing things? The big things. Airplanes." The waffle iron light changed. He poured the batter. "Sometimes," he said, "but you liked it." "I loved it," he said. It came out more easily than he expected, more directly than he usually let himself be about this. Maybe it was the morning. Maybe it was the way the G700's pressure loop had run clean. The 3-0 display with every parameter in range. That particular satisfaction he hadn't felt in 5 years, and didn't realize he'd been missing quite this much. "It was some of the best work I ever did." Lily was quiet for a moment, watching the waffle iron. "Can you do both?" she said. "Fix the airplanes and be here too?" "I don't know," he said. "I'm still figuring that out." "I would share you," she said, very seriously. "With the airplanes, if that helped." He looked at her. She was entirely earnest. This was not a bid for reassurance or a manipulative move, because she didn't operate that way. She'd said it because she meant it, because it seemed like the fair and logical thing to offer. "Thank you," he said, and he meant it the same way she'd said it, straight. She nodded, satisfied. "Don't let the waffles burn." He turned back to the waffle iron. Well, they ate at the kitchen table, Lily with her waffles and her carefully arranged strawberries, Gerald propped against the napkin holder in a position of dignified observation. She ate the way she always ate, methodically, going through the strawberries in a specific order that Ethan had never fully decoded, occasionally explaining to Gerald what she was doing and why. Ethan ate his waffles and drank his coffee and felt the morning's accumulated weight begin to settle into something less active, more bearable. "Daddy," Lily said with the tone that meant she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. "When you were fixing the airplane, were you scared?" He thought about 5:50 in the morning, the diagnostic interface, the sequence running, the room full of people watching, Vivian Sterling standing 15 feet back with that face that gave nothing away. "A little," he said, "not of the repair, of getting it wrong, of being sure I was right and finding out I wasn't." "But you were right." "I was." "Because you knew." "Because I knew." She ate a strawberry. "I get scared of being wrong too," she said. "At school. When Ms. Patterson asks a question and I think I know the answer but I'm not sure." "What do you do when that happens?" "I say it anyway." She looked up at him. "Because if I don't say it, then I'll never know." He looked at her, 6 years old, eating a waffle, explaining something to him about courage that she hadn't learned from him, that she'd figured out on her own in the small arena of a classroom, and was now delivering without any awareness of what it cost him to hear it. He put his fork down and said, "That's exactly right." She went back to her food, unconcerned. After breakfast, Lily dragged him to the living room for what she called investigation time, which meant she had questions about airplanes, and he was required to answer them. This had started about 3 months ago, when she'd spotted a documentary about aircraft design on the television and asked why wings bent upward at the tips. And he'd explained it, and she'd looked at him the way she'd looked at him in the car that morning, that quiet, recalibrating look. And from then on, intermittently, without advance notice, she would appear with questions. Today's questions were about pressure. She'd picked it up from what he'd told her in the car. "Why does a plane need to squeeze the air?" she asked. She was on the floor with a piece of paper drawing something that might have been an airplane or might have been a house. "Because the air up high is thin, not enough oxygen to breathe comfortably. So the airplane makes more air. It compresses the air it has, makes it denser, more like the air down here. What happens if it stops doing that? It gets hard to breathe, or at high altitude, impossible." She looked up from her drawing. Her expression was not alarmed, but it was serious. "That's dangerous. That's why they have sensors, to notice when something goes wrong." But the sensor was wrong today. He looked at her. He hadn't explained the details, but she'd assembled them from the pieces he'd given her, and the assembly was accurate. The sensor wasn't wrong. It was misreading something correctly, but interpreting it wrong. It thought there was a problem, when actually the problem was in how it had been taught to measure. She thought about this for a long moment. Her pen moved on the paper. "Like when I thought Tuesday's spelling test was Monday," she said. "I studied the right words, but I got the day wrong, so I thought I was going to fail." Exactly like that. She went back to her drawing. "I didn't fail." "I know. You got 100. 94, she said with precision. "I got necessary wrong. There are 2 S's and I only put 1. I'll put it on the refrigerator list." "It's already on the refrigerator list. I put it there myself." She held up the drawing. It was definitively an airplane, a round-bodied thing with optimistic wings and what appeared to be a smile. "Is this what the G700 looks like?" "Not exactly." "Fix it." He got down on the floor beside her and took the pen she offered and made adjustments. Longer fuselage, swept wings, the distinctive tail profile. And she watched him draw with the same focused attention she'd had during the strawberry operation. And he thought about Thursday and Sandra Kowalski and the conference room, and about the text from Marcus Chen that was still in his jacket pocket, unanswered, and about the G700 climbing through the clouds somewhere over the Pacific, carrying a woman he'd met 3 hours ago toward a deal he'd probably never know the outcome of. He handed the drawing back. "That's better," Lily said. She studied it. "I want to fix airplanes when I grow up." "You'd be good at it." "I'd be the best." She said it without arrogance, just as a confident projection. "Because I'll study a long time and then do it a long time, like you said. And because you'll say the answer even when you're not sure." She looked up at him and grinned, a gap-toothed, full-face grin, the kind that was still new enough to surprise him every time. "Yeah," she said. "That too." Teat. He got the text from Marcus Chen again at 2:15, a follow-up. "Mr. Sterling is boarding in approximately 40 minutes. She'd like to call before departure, if that's convenient. Approximately 2:45 p.m. your time." Lily was napping. She'd been fighting it for the last 40 minutes, insisting she wasn't tired, and had then fallen asleep mid-sentence on the couch, with Gerald tucked under her arm and her shoes still on, which Ethan had quietly removed and set by the coffee table. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him and looked at Marcus's text. He typed back, 2:45 works. He sat there in the quiet apartment. The refrigerator ran. The afternoon light came through the window over the sink at a flat angle and lit up the list there. Necessary. 2 S's, underlined, in her handwriting. He'd spent 5 years making himself small enough to fit inside a life that was, genuinely, the right size for him. He didn't regret it. He didn't regret any of it, which was the true answer, not the one that sounded like he was performing acceptance. But this morning had reminded him of something he'd forgotten was still in him. Not just the skill. The part of him that had stood in the hangar at 58 minutes past 5 and seen the fault code pattern and known, not guessed, not hoped, but known, what it meant and how to fix it. That part hadn't gone anywhere. He'd just stopped using it. The question of whether that was the same as losing it, he wasn't sure. His phone said 2:43. He held it in his hand and waited, and when it rang at 2:46, 1 minute late, which felt somehow human, he answered on the second ring. "Mr. Mercer." Vivian Sterling's voice on the phone was the same as it had been in the hangar. Direct, no preamble. "I have about 15 minutes. I wanted to use them to say something to you properly, rather than through Marcus. All right, he said. I've been in aviation-adjacent business for 20 years, she said. I know enough to understand what happened this morning. I know enough to understand what the alternative looked like. And I've spent the last 8 hours thinking about the fact that the person who saved my company's most important transaction in a decade was doing it while on a break from mopping floors. A pause. Not dramatic. She wasn't doing drama. Just giving the statement space. That bothers me. Not because of any judgment about your choices, because talent at that level is genuinely rare and genuinely matters, and the industry lost access to it when you walked away. Ethan said nothing. I'm not calling to recruit you, she continued. I don't run an aviation company. I'm calling because I want to do something specific, which is to make sure that what happened this morning is visible to the people who should know about it. With your permission, I want to put your name in front of 3 people I know in aerospace and aviation maintenance. People who have the context to understand what they're hearing. He looked at the refrigerator list. Why? Because you deserve to have options, she said. You made a choice 5 years ago that was the right choice for your family, and I respect it. But choices should come from options, not from having no path back. She paused. You can say no. I'll respect that too. The apartment was quiet. Lily was still asleep. Gerald was still under her arm. You can put my name out, he said. I'm not ready to make any decisions yet, but I'm open to conversations. That's all I'm suggesting. Her voice shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but less formal. How's your daughter? The question surprised him. She's napping, he said. She's fine. She ate waffles. How old? 6. A brief pause. I don't have children, Vivian said. I made a different choice. I'm not sure it was the right one. I'm not sure it was wrong either. She said it the way people say things they don't usually say out loud, carefully, with the awareness that they're departing from their normal register. You seem like you know what you chose and why. That's not as common as you'd think. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. I have to board, she said. Marcus will follow up with you about the contacts. And Mr. Mercer, a pause. For what it's worth, the way you worked this morning, the way you explained it to those engineers without making them feel small, that's a specific kind of intelligence that's even rarer than the technical knowledge. The line stayed open for a moment. Safe landing, he said. She ended the call. He set the phone on the table and sat with it. The afternoon light had moved. The refrigerator was still running. From the living room came the small sleep sound of Lily shifting position on the couch, a murmured syllable that wasn't quite a word. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. Thursday came the way Thursdays do when you've been thinking about them too much, too fast, and somehow also too slow, arriving before he'd decided exactly what he wanted from it. Ethan dropped Lily at daycare at 8:15. She went in without drama, which was not always the case. There were mornings when she had opinions about going, lengthy and well-structured opinions, and he'd learned to budget time for them. This wasn't one of those mornings. She walked in, said hi to her teacher, turned back once to wave at him with the hand that wasn't holding Gerald, and disappeared around the corner. He sat in the parking lot for a moment with the engine running. He'd told Sandra Kowalski 9 o'clock, and the drive from the daycare to Crestfield was 20 minutes, which meant he had time, which meant he sat there and did not use it productively. He thought about what he'd said to Lily on Wednesday. I'm open to conversations, and how those words had felt reasonable and measured when he said them. And now, in the daycare parking lot at 8:18 in the morning, felt like something that might have actual consequences. He pulled out. Sandra Kowalski's office was on the second floor of the Crestfield main building, above the hangar operations floor. It was a real office, not a conference room. She'd said conference room on the phone, but had apparently changed her mind because when her assistant led Ethan up and knocked on the half-open door, Sandra was at her desk with a spread of papers and 2 coffee cups already waiting on the low table by the window. She stood to shake his hand. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact, with close-cropped gray hair and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades on hangar floors and had the lower back to prove it. She had a direct way of looking at people. Not aggressive, just unambiguous. She wasn't performing warmth, And she wasn't performing authority. She was just a person in a room with another person, which Ethan found immediately easier than the alternative. "Thank you for coming in," she said. "Sit down. The coffee's real, from upstairs, not the break room machine." "I heard about the break room machine." Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile. "Dale told you. He gave me a cup, as an apology." "That sounds like Dale." She settled into the chair across from him. "He wrote a very thorough incident report, which I've now read 3 times because I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly before I had this conversation." Ethan nodded. "Walk me through it," she said. "From your perspective, what you saw, what you concluded, and why you decided to say something." It wasn't the question he'd expected. He'd expected something more administrative, background, credentials, how he'd ended up at Crestfield. This was more direct than that, and he respected it. He walked her through it, the sightline from the corridor, the access panel locations, the diagnostic equipment deployment, the fault code pattern he'd read from 60 feet without being able to see the actual numbers. He explained the thermal calibration drift logic, the specific operating conditions that would produce it on the G700 secondary loop, the reason the E14 code was misleading in isolation. Sandra listened without interrupting. She had a legal pad on the table that she didn't write on. When he finished, she said, "Why didn't you say something sooner? You were in that corridor. When did you first see the situation?" He thought about it. "Around 4:45, maybe 4:50. And you said something at approximately 5:30. "Yes." "That's 40 minutes. Closer to 45. What were you doing for 45 minutes? He looked at her. "My job." She held his gaze. "What made you decide to say something at all? It wasn't your problem. You weren't on shift with those engineers. Nobody was going to know if you'd walked past." It was a real question. He thought about the real answer. "I know what it looks like when an aircraft gets grounded for the wrong reason," he said. "I know what happens downstream. The people who miss connections, the deals that fall apart, the schedules that collapse. I know what a repair takes, the parts, the time, the certification chain. And I knew in this case that none of it was necessary." He paused. "There's a version of walking past where you tell yourself it's not your business. I've talked myself into that version before. I couldn't do it this time." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Why not this time?" He thought about Vivian Sterling standing at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, looking at him with that expression that wasn't quite readable. He thought about Dale Forsyth in the corridor with 2 cups of bad coffee, trying to figure out how to hold what had happened. "I don't know exactly," he said. "Sometimes you just can't." Sandra nodded slowly, and he had the feeling she understood that answer better than a more polished one would have satisfied her. She asked him about Meridian. He told her, keeping it factual, the timeline, the projects, the work on the G700 certification, the FAA advisory board. He said he'd left 5 years ago. She didn't ask why, which he noted, and which he appreciated. She asked him what he knew about Crestfield's maintenance operation. He told her what he'd observed in 5 months of working the night shift, the equipment, the certification levels of the staff, the workflow patterns, the things that were being done well, and the things that were being done correctly, but not optimally, which were different categories. She raised an eyebrow at that. "Such as?" He'd said it before he'd fully decided to, and now he had to follow through. "Your pre-diagnostic checklists for complex fault code presentations on G-series aircraft don't differentiate between primary and cascaded fault sources. The documentation exists to make that differentiation. It's in the supplement material, but it's not integrated into your field procedures. Roberto, one of your junior techs, spotted it himself on Wednesday." "He's right." Sandra picked up her pen. "Go on." "Your scheduling for complex maintenance operations puts your most experienced engineers on day shifts and leaves nights with certification levels that are adequate for routine work, but not for edge cases. That's a common structure in this industry. It's also the reason that at 4:50 in the morning, you had 3 certified engineers who couldn't identify a documented fault pattern that should have been caught in about 10 minutes. He paused. "I'm not criticizing your staff. I'm describing a structural gap." Sandra was writing now. "What else?" she said. He hadn't expected to be here this long. He hadn't expected her to ask that. Your technical library, he said. The supplement documentation for your aircraft fleet. It's all there. It's all current, but it's not indexed in a way that makes it searchable by fault code presentation. If you could cross-reference the documentation by fault code cluster, your engineers could pull the relevant section in seconds during a diagnostic situation instead of having to navigate the full manual. He stopped. That's a software problem, not a maintenance problem. I don't know what systems you're running. We're running a 12-year-old maintenance management platform that my predecessor chose and that I've been trying to replace for 3 years. She said it dryly, without heat. Budget is what it is. There are open source alternatives that could be configured for cross-referencing without a significant licensing cost. The integration work is the variable. Sandra set her pen down and looked at him. Mr. Mercer, she said, I called you in here because Dale's incident report flagged a significant event that I needed to understand. What I didn't expect was to walk away from this conversation with a structural analysis of my maintenance operation. She said it without irritation, more with the tone of someone recalibrating. You've been working here 5 months, 4 months and 3 weeks, and you've been watching. I notice things. It's a habit. From when you were an engineer. From before that, probably. I just didn't have anything to point it at. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside her window, the hangar floor was fully active. She could hear the equipment, the voices, the occasional radio. Normal Thursday morning operations. I'm going to be direct with you, she said, because I think you'll respond better to direct than to careful. Yes, he said. I want to bring you on in a technical advisory capacity, part-time to start, because I understand you have constraints on your time, and I'm not asking you to restructure your life. The scope would be maintenance protocol review and field procedure documentation, identifying gaps in our current procedures, developing updated checklists, cross-training senior staff on advanced diagnostic presentations. She paused. The janitor position would need to be filled separately. I can't hold it open. He sat with this. You're offering me a job. I'm offering you the right job, she said, or at least the beginning of one. What it becomes depends on what you want it to become. He looked out her window at the hangar floor. He'd spent 4 months and 3 weeks looking at that floor from below. The angle was different from up here. What are the hours? He said. Flexible. I'd want 10 to 15 hours a week to start. You set the schedule, we'll work around it. I have a 6-year-old. I understood that. Flexible means flexible. Pay? She named a figure. It was not a charity figure. It was a fair rate for a technical specialist, slightly below what someone with his background would have commanded in his Meridian years, but calibrated to the part-time scope. He registered that she'd done the math on it, that she hadn't lowballed him or inflated it to make herself feel good. He said, I need a few days to think about it. Take the week, she said. Call me by Monday. He stood. She stood. They shook hands again, and he was at the door when she said, One more thing. He turned. Tuesday morning, she said. Ms. Sterling's assistant called me. She asked me to confirm that the incident was documented correctly with your name in the record. She also mentioned she was forwarding your name to some contacts in the industry. Sandra's expression was neutral. I want you to know that this conversation was going to happen with or without Ms. Sterling's involvement. Dale's report alone would have brought me to you. I don't want you to think this job offer is downstream of someone else's phone call. Ethan looked at her. I didn't think that, he said, but I appreciate you saying it. He drove home with his windows down, which was not sensible because it was mid-October and the temperature was barely 50, but he needed the air moving. He needed something to be moving. He stopped at the coffee shop 2 blocks from the apartment, the one he went to when he was thinking about something and didn't want to sit still. He ordered a plain coffee and sat at the window table and watched people on the sidewalk and thought about the meeting. He thought about Sandra Kowalski's face when he'd described the structural gaps. Not defensive, not pleased exactly, but alert. The face of someone who was updating their picture of something in real time and doing it cleanly, without ego getting in the way. He'd worked for people like that and worked for people nothing like that, and the difference mattered more than almost any other variable. He thought about the fault code checklist that didn't exist yet. He could see it clearly already, the structure of it, The cross-reference logic, the way it should be organized to be useful under pressure at 5 in the morning, when your engineers were tired and the aircraft was grounded and the clock was moving. He could see it the way he could see the secondary loop calibration problem from 60 feet away. Not because he was exceptional, but because he'd looked at enough of these things long enough that they took a recognizable shape. He thought about Roberto asking to flag the documentation gap to Dale. Roberto was going to be a good engineer. He had the right instinct, not to dismiss what he didn't understand, but to look it up, verify it, act on it. That kind of instinct could be sharpened. It could be taught, if you had someone doing the teaching who'd actually done the work. He drank his coffee. He thought about Lily saying I would share you with the airplanes, if that helped. Marcus Chen called that afternoon, not about the job. He didn't know about the job. He called about Vivian's contacts. She wanted me to brief you before anyone reaches out, Marcus said. He had an efficient phone manner, clipped without being unfriendly. She gave your name to 3 people. I'll give you a little background on each so it's not completely cold when they call. Ethan was at the kitchen table. Lily was at the other end of it, doing homework that appeared to involve counting by 5s, which she was managing with the aid of her fingers and a focused frown. Go ahead, he said. First is James Whitfield. He's the VP of Technical Operations at Harrow Aviation Services. Mid-sized MRO, maintenance, repair, overhaul, based out of the Southeast. They work primarily on business and executive aircraft. G-Series, Bombardier, Embraer. He's a serious person. He'll want to talk technical before he talks anything else. Fine. Second is Dr. Angela Reyes. She's at the FAA, Technical Standards Division. You may know her name. She's been on the advisory board for about 4 years. He did know the name. He'd worked adjacent to her department during the Maintenance Protocol Standardization project, though he didn't think they'd ever been in the same room. I know of her. She reached out to Vivian, actually, Marcus said. When Vivian contacted her about you, she said she'd been aware of your work at Meridian, specifically the G700 supplement. Apparently it's been cited in FAA guidance documentation several times. Ethan said nothing for a moment. All right, he said. Third is less formal. Paul Engstrom. He's semi-retired, used to run the aerospace engineering program at Caldwell Technical Institute. He's building out a continuing education curriculum for working aviation maintenance professionals, advanced diagnostics specifically. He heard your name and he called Vivian back before she'd even finished the initial message. Lily looked up from her homework. 5, 10, 15, she said, then looked back down. You don't have to call any of them, Marcus said. Vivian wanted to be clear about that. She's opened the door, but she's not pushing you through it. I understood that. She also asked me to tell you, and this is a direct quote, so bear with me. Tell him that options don't expire if he doesn't use them immediately. They just become different options. A pause. I wrote it down because it seemed like something she actually wanted conveyed accurately. Ethan looked at the window over the sink, the refrigerator list. Necessary, 2 S's. Tell her I got that, he said, and tell her thank you. He called James Whitfield first, that same evening, after Lily was in bed. He'd put it off for 3 hours, found tasks that needed doing, dishes, a load of laundry, a review of the water heater situation that he'd been ignoring, and then sat on the edge of his bed at 9:45 and dialed. Whitfield picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call. Ethan Mercer, he said. His voice was a southern voice, unhurried, but there was precision underneath it. I was hoping you'd call tonight. I'm calling tonight, Ethan said. That's about all I can promise. A sound that might have been a laugh. Fair enough. Let me ask you something straight. You wrote the G700 secondary loop calibration procedure. When you wrote it, did you flag the fault code presentation issue? The E14 mislead? In the notes section, I recommended it be elevated to the primary diagnostic guidance. The committee decided to leave it as supplementary. Why? Because it was a narrow edge case presentation, and the committee was managing page count on the primary documentation. He said it without bitterness. It was just the fact. In an ideal world, the notes section would have been sufficient. In practice, people don't read the notes section at 5 in the morning. No, Whitfield said. They do not. A pause. How many aircraft presentations like that do you think you've got cataloged? Edge cases that aren't in primary guidance. Ethan thought about it. He hadn't thought about it exactly in those terms. For the aircraft series I worked on directly, 100 maybe, including adjacent systems, environmental control, pressurization, pneumatic supply. That's a significant body of knowledge. It's 900 hours of advisory board work and 11 years of field experience. Most of it lives in my head because I never had a reason to write it all down. What if you had a reason? The conversation went on for 40 minutes. Whitfield didn't offer him anything that night. He said he had some internal conversations to have first. He said he wanted Ethan to come down to his operation and spend a day looking at it before either of them made any commitments. He said he'd follow up the following week. What he did, effectively, was treat Ethan like a peer, like someone whose opinion of the operation mattered as much as any offer Whitfield might make. He asked what Ethan would want to see, what he'd want to know, what would make the conversation worth having for him. He asked these things sincerely, and he listened to the answers. Ethan hung up and sat in the quiet apartment for a while. 5 years. 5 years of being invisible in rooms, of being the person no one sees in the corridor, of having everything he knew live behind a face that people looked past. And in 1 week, one morning, really, the rest of it downstream of that morning, all of that had reversed, or begun to. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt unfamiliar, which was its own kind of uncomfortable. He called Angela Reyes on Friday afternoon. Lily was at school. He was at the kitchen table again, which had apparently become his place for significant phone calls. Dr. Reyes's manner was different from Whitfield's, more precise, faster, less social. She got to the substance within the first 90 seconds. The G700 supplement, she said. The thermal calibration section. I want to ask you about the decision to place the E14 guidance in the notes. I was just discussing that. I know, James called me. We collaborate occasionally. She didn't seem to think this required explanation. My question is whether you documented your recommendation at the time, that it should have been elevated. I sent a memo to the committee chair. I have a copy of it somewhere. I'd like to see it. He paused. Why? Because we're currently in a review cycle on the G700 maintenance supplement, and the notes section guidance on thermal calibration has come up 3 times in the past 18 months as a contributing factor in delayed maintenance diagnoses. Not accidents, but delays with downstream consequences. I want to understand the original decision-making. A pause. I also want to understand whether the supplement revision should come from a working group or whether we should bring in the original authors. The original authors are scattered, he said. I know where some of them are. I know where you are, she said. That's a start. He found the memo that evening. It was in a folder in a box in the closet, the box of things from Meridian that he'd never fully unpacked and never thrown away, existing in a kind of suspended state that matched, he supposed, how he'd thought of that part of his life. He opened the folder on the kitchen table and read the memo, which he'd written 9 years ago in a voice he barely recognized, precise and urgent and professionally frustrated. He'd flagged the issue clearly. The committee chair had responded with a 2-line email thanking him for his input and noting that the decision had been finalized. He put the memo back in the folder. He looked at the box. There were other folders in it, other projects. The notation files for the pressurization work, the draft procedures, the advisory board session summaries. 9 years of work that he'd put in a box and closed and stacked in a closet and told himself was finished. He didn't open the other folders that night. He put the lid back on the box and put it on the table where he could see it, which was different from where it had been. Saturday was Lily's. He had a rule about that, which he'd been maintaining for 5 years with near total consistency. Saturday belonged to her. Not Saturday morning and then errands and then other things. The whole day. Whatever she wanted to do with it. What she wanted to do with it this particular Saturday was go to the Science Museum. The Science Museum was a 40-minute drive and had a parking situation he found genuinely irritating, and it was always crowded on Saturdays, and the cafeteria food was not good, and none of this mattered because Lily loved it with a ferocity that had been consistent since the first time he'd taken her at age 4, and she had stood in front of the human heart model and asked him 17 consecutive questions. They went to the aviation section first, because they always went to the aviation section first, because Lily had decided this was the correct order, and he had not found a compelling argument against it. The aviation section had a cutaway model of a commercial aircraft fuselage, showing the interior systems, hydraulics, electrical, environmental control. It also had an interactive pressurization display that Ethan had always thought was technically imprecise in a few ways that probably didn't matter for the purposes of a children's museum exhibit, but that Lily found captivating. She stood in front of it and read every panel. She always read every panel. He stood beside her and watched her read. "It says the pressure system keeps the air like we're on a mountain," she said. "About 8,000 feet equivalent," he said. "The air up where the plane flies is much thinner than that, but the system brings it down to mountain level. Why not all the way down to regular level? Wait. If you pressurize more, the structure has to be stronger. Stronger means heavier. Heavier means more fuel." She looked at the display. "It's a trade," she said. "That's exactly what it is." She moved along the panel. "Daddy?" "Yeah." "When you were fixing things before, did you like it more than now?" He looked at the cutaway fuselage, the tiny labeled components, the color-coded systems. "I liked the work," he said. "I'm not sure I liked everything around it." "What didn't you like?" He thought about how to say it in terms she'd track. "When you work on something really important, there are a lot of people who want to tell you how to do it. Not because they know better, because it matters to them for other reasons." "What other reasons?" "Money, credit, control." He paused. "I was good at the technical part. I wasn't as good at managing all those other things. Your mom was better at it than me. She understood people in a way I never quite did." He said it carefully. He didn't talk about Claire often, not because it hurt too much, but because he didn't want to burden Lily with managed grief. He let it come up when it came up. She would have known how to hold the work and the politics together. I could only really do one at a time. Lily looked up at him. "I think I'm more like her," she said. "I understand people." "You do," he said. "You're very much like her. But I also want to fix things. You can be both." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything that mattered. "Okay," she said, and moved on to the next panel. On the drive home, with Lily drowsy in the back seat and Gerald in his usual position, she said, without preliminary, "Are you going to go back to fixing airplanes?" "I'm thinking about it," he said. "Full-time?" "No. Part-time, maybe. To start." "So you'd still be here?" "I'd still be here. More here, actually, because the part-time job pays better. I might not need as many night shifts." She processed this. "More morning waffles?" "Possibly." "I think you should do it," she said. It wasn't permission, not exactly, but it was something in that direction. The confident assessment of someone who has considered the variables and arrived at a conclusion. "You think so?" "You're really good at it," she said simply. "You shouldn't waste it." He looked in the rearview mirror. She was looking out her window at the passing dark, her voice already going a little soft at the edges with coming sleep. "What if I make mistakes?" he said. "You'll fix them," she said. "Because that's what you do." She was asleep within 5 minutes. He drove the rest of the way home in a quiet he didn't want to fill with anything. Not the radio, not thought, just the road and the sound of the car and his daughter asleep in the back seat with her elephant. Oh. Sunday he found the memo about the FAA committee. He also found, in the same folder, the original draft of the thermal calibration procedure sound, his draft, before the committee had reviewed it, with his handwriting in the margins. Notes to himself about edge cases. The E-14 flag was there, circled in red pen, with a note beside it that said, "This will cause a misdiagnosis." Primary guidance, not notes. He'd known then. He'd said so, clearly, to himself and to the committee. And the committee had decided differently, and he'd let it go because that was how things worked, and because there were other battles, and because at the time he'd had enough of the battles. He smoothed the draft on the kitchen table and looked at his own handwriting from 9 years ago, the certainty in it, the red circle. He took a photo of it with his phone. Then he took a photo of the memo. Then he sent both to Angela Reyes with a brief note. Found what you asked about. He'll call Monday to follow up. He closed the folder. He called Sandra Kowalski on Monday morning, 8:45, before Lily's drop-off. I'll take the position, he said when she answered. Part-time, the hours we discussed. I want to start with the pre-diagnostic checklist project, and I want Roberto involved. A pause. Not surprise, more like the sound of something landing correctly. Roberto, she said. He's got the right instincts. He spotted the documentation gap himself. If he's part of developing the new procedure, he'll know it better than anyone, and he'll teach it better than anyone. That's probably true. I'd also like access to your full maintenance management system. I want to look at the cross-reference problem. I may know someone who can help with the software side. Someone? A contact from before. He does systems architecture. He owes me a conversation. Another pause. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about this since Thursday, he said. I just wanted to be sure before I said it. That's reasonable. Her voice had the quality it had in her office. Direct, reliable, no unnecessary warmth, and no unnecessary cold. Monday the 14th work for you to start? Yes? Good. I'll have HR send the paperwork today. A beat. Mr. Mercer, I'm glad you called. So am I, he said. He picked up Lily at 3:15. She had paint on her left hand and a drawing in her right that she thrust at him before he'd fully gotten through the daycare door. I made it for you, she said. It was an airplane, more accurate than the last one. She'd been working on the wings, he could tell, refining the sweep based on the drawing they'd done together on Wednesday. The fuselage was rounder than a G700's, but not by much. The tail was a reasonable approximation, and underneath it, in her careful first-grade print, for Daddy who fixes things. He looked at it for a moment. It's very good, he said. I know, she said. Gerald helped. He folded it once, carefully, and put it in his jacket pocket. Come on, he said. Let's go home. The drawing went on the refrigerator. Not with a magnet, he ran out of magnets, so he used a piece of masking tape at each corner, and it sat there between the spelling list and a school calendar that was already 2 weeks out of date, slightly crooked, for Daddy who fixes things in careful first-grade print. He straightened it twice and then left it crooked because that was how it had gone up, and that felt right. He stood in front of the refrigerator for a moment with his hand still on the tape. Monday the 14th was 9 days away. 9 days wasn't very long to finish thinking about a decision he had already made, but was still getting used to having made. The first person he told was his sister. Nora lived 40 minutes north in a house that was always slightly too warm and always had something baking in it, which had been true since she was 16 and had decided that cooking was the thing she was going to be relentlessly good at. She was 3 years younger than Ethan and had the directness that sometimes comes with being the younger sibling, a lifetime of having to say things clearly because the older one wasn't paying attention. She'd been his fallback when Claire died, not in a dramatic way. Nora wasn't dramatic, but in the practical way that mattered most. She'd shown up. She'd kept showing up. She'd watched Lily on night shifts for the first 8 months until Ethan had the daycare situation sorted, and she'd never once said anything about the choice he'd made about his career that wasn't supportive, which he knew had cost her something because Nora had opinions and usually expressed them. He called her on Sunday evening while Lily was in the bath. I took a job, he said, before she could say anything. A pause. What kind of job? Technical advisory at Crestfield, part-time. Maintenance protocol and documentation. The pause this time was longer. He could hear her processing it, the particular sound of Nora deciding what to say first. Aerospace, she said. Yes. At the airport where you've been mopping floors. Same building, different role. Ethan. Her voice had something in it that wasn't quite emotion, but was adjacent to it. That's okay. Okay. Walk me through it. He walked her through the Tuesday morning, the same way he'd walked Dale Forsyth and Sandra Kowalski through it. The aircraft, the fault codes, the decision to say something. He kept it technical, because that was the part he was comfortable narrating. When he got to the part about Vivian Sterling standing at the bottom of the aircraft stairs, Nora interrupted. She just asked you why you left. She asked, I told her. And you told her? About Claire? About Lily? Some of it. Another pause. You don't tell people that. I know. You barely tell me that, and I was there. He didn't have an answer for that. She was right. He'd spent 5 years keeping the explanation internal, filing it under private where it belonged, not because he was ashamed of it, but because it was his and Lily's, and he didn't feel like it needed an audience. Something about that morning had loosened whatever mechanism maintained that boundary. He wasn't sure yet if that was good or not. How does Lily feel about it? Nor asked. She told me I should do it, said I was wasting the skill. A sound that was definitely a laugh, short and involuntary. She's 6. She's right. She is right, Nor agreed. She takes after her mother in that way. A beat. She takes after you in the other ways. The stubborn ones. I'm not stubborn. Ethan, you mopped floors for 5 years rather than ask anyone for help. That's not... I wasn't... He stopped, because she wasn't wrong about any of the facts, only possibly the interpretation. It wasn't stubbornness, it was a choice. You can call it whatever you want, she said, not unkindly. I'm just glad you're moving again, even if it took a billionaire's broken airplane to get you there. Well, the paperwork from Sandra's HR department arrived by email Monday afternoon. A contractor agreement, a confidentiality form, an access request for the maintenance management system. He read every line, which was a habit from his Meridian days that he'd never lost, and signed where it required signing and sent it back. He also sent an email to Paul Engstrom, the third contact Marcus had mentioned, the one building the continuing education curriculum at Caldwell Technical Institute. He kept it brief. He'd been given Engstrom's name, he understood the project. He was interested in talking but had constraints on his time, and could they set up a call? Engstrom replied in 11 minutes. He had the energy of someone who had been waiting for a response for a while. They talked on Tuesday for almost 2 hours, which was longer than Ethan had expected and longer than he'd been prepared for. But Engstrom was the kind of person whose enthusiasm was contagious, not because it was loud, but because it was completely genuine and very specific. He wasn't building a generic continuing education program. He was building a curriculum around advanced diagnostic reasoning, the process of working through complex, ambiguous fault presentations in high-stakes environments. He'd been looking for practitioners who could teach from actual cases rather than from textbooks. The textbook knowledge is available, Engstrom said. He was on speakerphone, and Ethan could hear him moving around. Pacing, probably. Every maintenance professional in the country has access to the same documentation. What they don't have access to is the reasoning framework of someone who's seen the edge cases and worked through them in the field. That's not written down anywhere. It's in people's heads. And the people who have it are mostly retired or, well, scattered. Or mopping floors, Ethan said. A pause. Then a laugh. A genuine one. I heard about Tuesday morning. Vivian Sterling is a friend of the Institute's. She was, let's say she was emphatic about your name when she called. She's emphatic about most things. True. But she's not usually emphatic about people. She's usually emphatic about outcomes. He paused. I want to be direct with you. I'm not offering you a faculty position. I don't have the budget for that, and I don't think that's what you'd want anyway. What I'm offering is a consulting relationship. We develop case-based curriculum together. You lead a handful of workshops per year. The Institute handles all the administrative weight. You'd be working with working maintenance professionals, not students, people who are already in the field and need the advanced reasoning framework. Ethan thought about Roberto, about the way Roberto had read the supplement and then gone to flag the gap to Dale, about the specific combination of instinct and initiative that could be cultivated in the right environment with the right material. How many workshops? He said. 3 to start. Quarterly, with 1 gap. We'd iterate the curriculum between each one based on what lands and what doesn't. I'd want to develop the case material myself. Real cases, anonymized. That's what I want too. And I want the engineers in the room to be able to challenge the case analysis. I'm not interested in standing in front of a group and performing expertise. I want it to work like a real diagnostic problem. Multiple possible readings, actual disagreement, people working through it together. Engstrom was quiet for a moment. Then, that's exactly how I want it to work. That's the whole design philosophy. I just couldn't find anyone who was willing to teach it that way. Why not? Because it requires being wrong sometimes in front of a room full of people. Most subject matter experts find that uncomfortable. Ethan thought about the hangar, about standing in the corridor with the mop handle and the partial sight line and the certainty that could have been wrong, about what it would have felt like to walk Dale through the recalibration sequence and have it come back with another fault code. He'd been certain, but certain wasn't the same as incapable of error, and he'd known that the whole time. I can do that, he said. He told Lily about the new job properly on Wednesday morning while she was eating cereal. He sat across from her and explained it in terms she could follow. He was going to help the people at the airport fix their paperwork for fixing airplanes, and sometimes he was going to teach other people who fixed airplanes how to fix them better. She ate a spoonful of cereal and considered this. Like a teacher, she said. Part teacher, part writer. He thought about it. You know how at the museum there's the woman who knows everything about the dinosaur exhibit? And when you ask her a question, she knows the answer, but she also knows why the question matters. Lily nodded. She'd had multiple conversations with that woman, extended conversations. Like that, he said. Miss Patterson says the best learners become the best teachers, Lily said. Miss Patterson is right. She ate more cereal. Will you still be here in the mornings? More than before? Will you still do waffles on Wednesdays? That was never in question. She seemed satisfied. She pushed her spoon around the bowl. Is it because of the lady, the one whose airplane you fixed? Partly, he said. She opened some doors, but I would have walked through them eventually anyway. How do you know? He thought about the box in the closet, the folder, the red circled note from 9 years ago, the maintenance management system waiting on his laptop with its 12-year-old architecture and its uncross-referenced documentation that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Because the problems were still there, he said. They don't go away just because you stop looking at them. Lily absorbed this. Then, Gerald thinks that's true about everything, not just airplanes. Gerald's wise. He knows, she said seriously. Monday the 14th arrived the way Ethan had been half expecting it to, ordinarily. No particular wait to the morning. The alarm at 6:30, the same as always. Lily awake before him, already in the kitchen with her cereal box, negotiating with Gerald about something he couldn't quite follow. He put on different clothes than he'd been wearing for 5 years. Not a uniform, just clothes. Dark slacks, a collared shirt, the jacket that wasn't his good jacket, but was better than his daily jacket. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment and didn't think anything in particular. You look different, Lily said when he came out. Different how? She tilted her head. Like before, but here, she said, which was the kind of thing she said sometimes that he'd learned to receive without trying to fully translate. He dropped her at daycare. She hugged him with her usual efficiency, told Gerald to behave. Gerald was coming along today, tucked into her backpack, and went inside. Sandra's assistant had given him a parking pass and a building access badge on a lanyard. The badge said consultant, which was a word that had always seemed slightly vague to him and still did, but it was accurate. He badged through the door at 8:52 and walked up to the second floor. Sandra was in her office. She waved him to the small conference table along the wall. Her office had one, he hadn't noticed it the first time, where there was a laptop open, a printed copy of the maintenance management system documentation, and another copy that he hoped was from upstairs. It was. Roberto's meeting us at 9:30, she said. I thought you'd want 20 minutes with the system first. He sat down and looked at the laptop. The maintenance management platform was, as advertised, 12 years old and showed it. The interface architecture was functional but rigid, with a hierarchical menu structure that assumed the user knew exactly where they were going before they started. Fault code documentation was sorted by aircraft series and then by system category, which was logical in the abstract and inconvenient when you were troubleshooting a cascaded fault presentation that touched multiple systems and needed to compare documentation across categories. He spent the 20 minutes navigating it. Not learning it, he'd largely learned it in the first 5 minutes, but mapping it. Understanding the logic of what was there and where the logic broke down. The cross-referencing problem is structural, he said when Sandra came back with her own coffee. It's not a feature they forgot to add. The platform wasn't designed for cross-reference search. To do it properly, you'd need to either replace the platform or build a supplementary index that sits on top of it. The platform replacement has been approved in principle for 18 months and is stuck in procurement, she said. That's where we are. What's the supplementary index look like in terms of build complexity? I don't know. I don't have that kind of technical background. The person I mentioned, but the systems contact. Can I bring him in for a conversation? Informally, just to scope it? Yes, she said. If it costs money, it goes through me before it goes anywhere. But a conversation costs nothing. He nodded. He made a note on the pad she'd left for him, then looked up when someone knocked on the open door. Roberto was 26, which Ethan hadn't fully registered in the low light of the hangar at 5 in the morning. He was also, in this context, visibly nervous in the way young professionals are nervous when they've been called into a meeting with someone whose career is significantly more established than theirs, and they're not sure why. "You asked for me?" he said, looking between Sandra and Ethan. "Sit down," Sandra said. She nodded at Ethan. "Roberto," Ethan said, "you flagged the documentation gap to Dale after Tuesday morning." Roberto sat. "Yeah, he appreciated it. He said he'd look into updating the pre-diagnostic procedure." "He will. But the update is going to need someone to actually write it." He looked at Roberto steadily. "I'm going to write the first version. I want you to review it, challenge it, and then teach it to the rest of the day shift team." Roberto stared at him. "Teach it. You found the gap. You understand why it matters. You're the right person to explain it to your colleagues. Not because you have the most seniority, you obviously don't, but because you'll explain it in a way they can use because you came to it the same way they'll come to it. From the documentation, not from a decade of field experience." A pause. Roberto was doing the mental work of adjusting to what he was being asked. "What if I explain it wrong?" he said. "Then I'll correct you. That's the whole point. If you explain it perfectly on the first try, we don't learn where the gaps in the explanation are." Ethan paused. "The goal isn't to perform understanding. It's to develop it. Those are different activities." Roberto looked at Sandra, then back at Ethan. "Okay," he said. "Yeah, okay. Good. Come find me when your shift starts Thursday. I'll have the first draft done by then." Ishimamun. He worked in the small office Sandra had allocated him, a room that had apparently been a storage space until recently, still smelling faintly of cardboard and industrial cleaner, which was not entirely unfamiliar. There was a desk, a chair, a window that looked onto the access road rather than the hangar, and a second chair he'd have to ask someone to bring up. He opened the maintenance management platform on his laptop and started pulling the documentation. He read through the G700 supplement sections he'd been involved in writing, which was a strange experience, like reading your own letters from a decade ago, recognizing the voice and the thinking without quite identifying with them. The pre-diagnostic checklist draft took him 3 hours. He wrote it the way he'd written maintenance documentation at Meridian, which was the way he'd taught himself to write technical material. Start with the failure mode the user is likely to encounter, not the ideal diagnostic sequence. Build toward the ideal from the reality, not the other way around. Put the most common misread at the top, with the reason for the misread explained before the correct interpretation, because knowing why something looks wrong is what makes you remember that it isn't. He wrote a note in the margin. This is for the engineer at 5 a.m. who hasn't slept enough and is looking at an E14 on a screen and needs to know what to do before calling the manufacturer. He left the note in the draft. Sometimes the margins told you more than the document. Matt. Dale Forsyth knocked it on his door at 2 in the afternoon. "Heard you're in the building now," Dale said. He had the slightly guarded look of a man who was genuinely pleased about something and wasn't entirely sure how to show it without overdoing it. "Apparently." Dale looked at the office. The desk, the laptop, the printed documentation spread across the surface, the second chair that still wasn't there. "They gave you the storage room." "It's fine. It smells like boxes. I've worked in worse." He looked at Dale. "I'm going to need a second chair at some point." "I'll find you one," Dale came in and leaned against the doorframe instead of fully entering, which was the posture of someone who wanted to have a conversation but wasn't sure how long it was supposed to be. "How's the advisory thing going?" "First day." "Right." A pause. "I told my team this morning about who you are, the full version. Meridian, the G700 program, the advisory board work." He said it carefully. "I hope that's okay. They were going to find out eventually, and I'd rather they heard it from me than through the building rumor cycle." Ethan thought about it. How'd they react? Priya was unsurprised. She said she knew something was off about the situation from the start. A small grimace. Roberto told her he'd already figured it out, which I think was a slight exaggeration. The two junior guys were, I think, stunned is accurate. One of them asked me 3 separate times if you were actually working here now. "What did you tell him?" "I said yes and to stop asking." Dale shifted his weight. "What I didn't tell them, what I'm telling you, is that I feel like I owe you more than a handshake and an apology." "You don't." "I dismissed you without giving you a fair hearing," Dale said. "In front of your employer, in front of Miss Sterling's team. I looked at your uniform and I made a decision." "Dale," Ethan said it evenly, "you made a reasonable professional judgment based on available information. When the information changed, you updated. That's the correct behavior. If you'd done it differently, if you just deferred to me because I said so, without testing the claim, that would actually be the concerning version." Dale was quiet for a moment. "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate." He paused. "You also made sure the record was correct. You put my name in the documentation the way it should be. That matters more than the first reaction." Dale nodded. He looked at the printed documentation on the desk. "Is that the new checklist?" "First draft." "Can I look?" Ethan turned the draft toward him. Dale read it standing up in the doorframe, which was apparently how he was going to do this conversation. He read without commenting for a few minutes. Then he said, "The E14 framing. You've put it at the top. It's the most dangerous misread in common circulation on this aircraft. It needs to be first. The manufacturer's existing guidance puts it third. The manufacturer's existing guidance was written for an ideal diagnostic environment. This is for the field." Dale read further. The margin note. He looked up. "You wrote for the engineer at 5 a.m. who hasn't slept enough. Is that a problem?" A pause. Then something shifted in Dale's face, the guardedness easing. "No," he said. "It's not a problem. I think it's the most useful thing in the document." He set the draft back on the desk. "I'm going to let you work." He left, and Ethan heard him on the stairs, and then the hangar floor sounds resumed their normal register, and he turned back to the laptop. Vivian Sterling's plane landed in Tokyo on a Tuesday. Ethan knew this only because Marcus sent a brief text confirming it. "Arrived safely. Meeting on schedule. She asked me to let you know. No response necessary." He read it at the kitchen table Thursday evening, after Lily was in bed, with the second draft of the checklist open on his laptop. He typed back, "Thank you. Good luck with the meeting," and then put his phone down and went back to the document. The checklist was cleaner in the second draft. He'd taken Roberto's review seriously. Roberto had found 2 places where the logic jumped without sufficient bridging, places where Ethan had assumed knowledge that a working engineer wouldn't necessarily have. He'd bridged them. He'd also added a third section that he hadn't initially planned on adjacent fault presentations in the primary loop that could appear simultaneously with the secondary loop calibration issue and require differentiated response. Because once you started building the tool properly, it became clear what the tool actually needed to contain. It was good work. He could feel it being good work, which was a different sensation than completing work, and one he'd missed without being able to name what he was missing. He saved the document and closed the laptop and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment. The box from the closet was still on the table, where he'd left it after finding the memo. He hadn't opened it again since Sunday. He reached over now and lifted the lid. The folders were organized the way he'd organized everything at Meridian, by project, chronological within each project, with handwritten labels on the tabs. He'd done it himself, because the administrative assistants at Meridian had their own system and he'd never fully trusted it for his personal files. He read the labels. G700 certification, Phase 1. G700 certification, Phase 2, Environmental Control Systems, 777 Series. FAA Advisory Board. Session Files, 2014 to 2016. Pressure Systems Theory. Reference Materials. That last one was thick. He pulled it out. It was his own reference compilation, papers, annotated copies of published research, his own notes on the theoretical underpinnings of the systems he worked on. He'd built it over years, the way you build any personal reference library, adding to it when something was useful, cross-referencing his own annotations. He'd been, in his Meridian years, a serious student of the field in a way that went beyond what his job required. He'd read because he found it genuinely interesting, which was the most honest motivation there was. He opened the folder and looked at the first document, his own handwriting in the margins of a photocopied journal article on thermal dynamics in pressurized aircraft environments. This is the theoretical basis for the G700 secondary loop behavior. Needs field validation. Field validation. He'd written that in 2013. He'd provided the field validation himself. 3 years later, in the calibration procedure he'd spent 6 months developing. And then he'd put it in a box and closed it and stacked it in a closet. He read for an hour. He hadn't meant to read for an hour. The material pulled him in the way it always had. Not because he'd forgotten any of it, but because reading it in this context, at this table, in this apartment, was different from reading it at Meridian. It felt less like review and more like reunion. He put the folder back and closed the box, but he didn't put the box back in the closet. He left it on the table. The Friday before the second week, Sandra called him into her office for what she called a quick check-in and was actually, in the way of most check-ins, not entirely quick. She wanted to know how the first week had felt. He told her, productive, clearer on the scope than he'd expected, more complex in the software problem than the initial conversation had suggested. She asked about Roberto. He said Roberto was sharp, and that his explanation of the checklist logic to the day shift team had been better than Ethan's own first articulation of it, which was exactly what was supposed to happen. He's going to be a strong engineer, Ethan said, if someone develops him deliberately. Are you volunteering? I'm saying it's worth someone's attention, yours, Dale's, whoever has the bandwidth. She made a note. What about the Engstrom thing, the Caldwell curriculum? We've had 3 calls. We're developing the first case study together. I want to use an anonymized version of Tuesday morning as the anchor case. Using Crestfield? Anonymized. Aircraft series, fault presentation, diagnostic sequence, resolution. No Crestfield, no names, just the case. She thought about it. I'd want to review the anonymization before it goes to any curriculum. That's fair. I'll send it to you before I send it to Engstrom. She nodded. She looked at her notes for a moment, then looked up. Can I ask you something that's not strictly professional? You can ask. How are you doing with all of this? Not the work, the shift. He considered the question. Sandra was not, he'd established, a person who asked questions she wasn't genuinely interested in the answers to. I'm adjusting, he said. It's faster than I expected. The work itself it's familiar. It was always familiar. I was just doing something else with my time. He paused. The harder part is the interior adjustment, allowing it to matter again without letting it matter too much. Too much meaning? Meaning I built a life around one priority, and now I'm making room for a second one. The first one doesn't shrink to accommodate the second. You have to find a different configuration. Sandra nodded slowly. My husband is a retired pilot, she said. When he retired, grounded for medical reasons, not by choice, he went through something like what you're describing, but in reverse. He had to learn to let the second thing, the family and the home and the dailiness of it, become enough without the first thing anchoring it. She paused. He took about 2 years to find the configuration, which I'm mentioning not to be discouraging, but because I think the finding takes as long as it takes. 2 years. He'll say it was worth it. She said it neutrally. I believe him, but it was 2 years. Ethan sat with that for a moment. Then, my daughter told me she'd share me with the airplanes. Sandra's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a softening, the kind that happens involuntarily. How old is she? She asked. 6. And she said that herself. completely unprompted. Sandra looked at him with something that was, he thought, a kind of respect that had nothing to do with the G700 or the checklist or the FAA advisory board. "Hold on to that," she said. It wasn't advice exactly, more like acknowledgement. The call from Angela Reyes came on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks into the advisory role. Ethan was in his office. It smelled less like boxes now. Someone had brought a second chair and a small plant that he hadn't asked for and suspected was Sandra's doing, working on the second draft of the case study for Engstrom. "I submitted a formal request to the FAA Supplement Review Committee," Angela said, with her usual efficiency of opening, "to bring you in as a consultant on the G700 thermal calibration section revision. The committee chair has approved it. I wanted to tell you before the formal letter arrives so you weren't blindsided." He set down his pen. "When does the review begin?" "We're targeting January, 3 sessions likely. Washington for the first, remote for the others if we can make the case for it." She paused. "The letter will outline the scope and the compensation. I want to be clear that this is a genuine consulting engagement, not a courtesy gesture." "I understand the difference." "I thought you might, but I wanted to say it anyway." A brief pause. "Your memo from 2014 was very clear on the E14 issue. The committee chair who received it is no longer at the FAA, but his decision is in the record. We're going to address it." He thought about the red circle. "This will cause a misdiagnosis. Primary guidance, not notes." 9 years, he said. Not bitterly, just as a fact. "Yes," Angela said. 9 years. Which is not unusual, frankly, in regulatory timelines, but is not something I'm inclined to defend." A pause. "What finally moved it was your case in October. 3 engineers certified missed a documented diagnostic guidance gap. That's exactly the kind of event the review process is supposed to respond to." It responded. "Better late than the alternative." That's the optimistic framing, yes. He was at his window when they finished the call, looking at the access road, the gray October light, a service vehicle moving between the main building and the hangar. He thought about the committee chair's 2-line email from 2014. He thought about the note he'd written to himself in the margin of a draft procedure that no one else ever read. He thought about the fact that the note had been right, and that the aircraft had kept flying on the wrong guidance for 9 years. And that on a Tuesday morning in October, a woman named Vivian Sterling had been trying to get to Tokyo, and a maintenance crew had been about to pull a perfectly functional component, and he had been standing in a corridor with a mop and a partial sightline and a decision to make. He didn't feel vindicated. He didn't have the right word for what he felt. It was something quieter than vindication and more durable. The specific feeling of having been part of a chain of consequence that extended further than you could see when you were in the middle of it. He picked up his pen. He went back to the case study. Sit. 2 days later, a package arrived at the Crestfield building, addressed to him care of Sandra Kowalski, with a return address from a Tokyo hotel. Inside was a handwritten note on plain hotel stationery. Not Vivian Sterling's usual medium, he guessed, which made it feel deliberate, and a copy of the signed Haramoto acquisition documents, redacted to remove the financials, with a post-it note attached in a different handwriting that said, "Marcus thought you might want proof it worked." The handwritten note was brief. "Mr. Mercer," it read. "The deal closed at 2:47 p.m. local time, 47 minutes inside the deadline. Kenji Haramoto shook my hand and said the word for reliable in Japanese, which is apparently the highest compliment he gives. I told him I'd had some help with the reliability. He asked from whom. I said from a man who understands that the problem is never where it first appears to be. He seemed to find that satisfactory. I hope you're well. V.S." He read it twice and put it in the desk drawer. He picked Lily up at 3:15. She had news about Priya. The Priya from daycare, who had apparently graduated from 5 dinosaur names to 11, which Lily reported with the measured approval of someone who respected genuine progress. "I helped her," Lily said. "I made her flashcards." That was thoughtful. "She learned Parasaurolophus," Lily said. "That's a hard one." "It's a very hard one." She considered this for a block. Daddy, did the airplane ladies' meeting go okay? The one in Japan? He looked at her in the rearview mirror. He hadn't told her about the package. Yes, it went well. Because of what you fixed. Partly. Good, she said. She looked out the window. Gerald's hungry. Gerald can wait until we get home. He says he can wait, but he wants you to know. Message received, he said. She smiled, and the late afternoon light caught her face at the angle that showed her mother's cheekbones, and he drove them home through the ordinary streets of their ordinary life and felt, without quite naming it, that the configuration was beginning to take its shape. November arrived the way it always does in that part of the country. Not dramatically, not with a single cold morning that announces itself, but gradually, the light changing first, going flatter and more honest, and then the temperature following. And then one morning you're scraping frost off the windshield and you realize it's been winter for a week already without your quite noticing. Ethan noticed it on a Tuesday, exactly 4 weeks after the other Tuesday, the one that had rearranged things. He was scraping the Honda's windshield at 7:15, Lily waiting in the back seat with Gerald and a thermos of hot chocolate that she was not supposed to open until they were parked, and he was thinking about the FAA letter that had arrived the previous afternoon. The formal consulting engagement notice, 3 sessions beginning in January, Washington for the first, and about the Engstrom curriculum draft that he'd sent over on Sunday, and that Engstrom had responded to at 11:30 the same night with a message that was mostly exclamation points and one substantive question about the case study framing. He was thinking about these things and scraping frost, and the morning felt, in its texture, like most mornings felt. Ordinary. The particular ordinariness of a life that is actually working, which is a different quality of ordinary than the kind that is merely the absence of crisis. Done? Lily called from inside the car. Almost. Gerald's bored. Gerald can look out the window. He says the frost is pretty. Gerald has good taste. He finished the windshield, got in, and they drove to daycare through streets that were still mostly quiet, the early morning light sitting low and pale across the rooftops. The pre-diagnostic checklist had been formally adopted by Crestfield's maintenance operations 3 weeks earlier. Sandra had put it through the approval process with a speed that suggested she'd been waiting for something like it for a while, and Dale had incorporated it into the pre-shift briefing structure for both day and night teams. Roberto had led the training sessions for his shift, 4 of them, 30 minutes each, built around the case study logic, and had done it, by all accounts, without either over-explaining or under-explaining, which was the hard balance. Ethan had sat in on the second session. He'd sat in the back and not said a word for the first 25 minutes, which had taken more discipline than he'd expected because there were moments when Roberto was working through the E14 logic, and Ethan could see from the faces of the engineers which parts were landing and which weren't quite, and the instinct to step in and clarify was strong. He didn't. He let Roberto find his own level. In the last 5 minutes, one of the day shift engineers, an experienced woman named Karen, who had 15 years of certification and the skepticism that came with it, raised her hand and said, "What about the adjacent primary loop presentation? The one in section 3 of the new checklist. I've never actually seen that in the field." Roberto looked at her. "Neither have I," he said. "But Mr. Mercer has, twice. He said it presents almost identically to the secondary loop issue, but the fix is completely different. If you misread it, you correct the wrong loop and the fault comes back." He paused. He said the best diagnostic tool for differentiating them is to run the secondary loop verification first and not assume the primary is involved until the secondary is clean. Karen thought about that. "Makes sense," she said. "That's what I thought," Roberto said. Ethan had walked out after the session without interrupting because the session hadn't needed him, which was the whole point. James Whitfield visited Crestfield in mid-November. He'd suggested it himself, casually, in their third phone call, said he wanted to see Ethan's work in context rather than just talk about it abstractly, and that he'd be in the region anyway on other business. Ethan had mentioned it to Sandra, who'd said fine, and arranged a visitor's pass, and then done the professional courtesy of staying out of whatever conversation was going to happen. Whitfield was a tall man in his early 60s who moved through hangars, the way people move through places they've spent most of their lives. He looked at things. He noticed equipment positioning and workflow patterns and the way crew members communicated during active operations. He asked Dale 2 technical questions that were precise enough that Dale answered them fully, and then looked at Whitfield with revised assessment. He spent an hour with Ethan in the small office. "What Engstrom is building," Whitfield said. He was in the second chair, the one someone had finally brought up, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "The curriculum, is it going to be what he says it's going to be? If we build it right." "What does building it right look like?" "It looks like the case studies being genuinely difficult, not illustrative examples with obvious answers. Real diagnostic problems where the correct path isn't clear until you've worked through 2 or 3 wrong paths first." He paused. "The instinct in curriculum development is to make things learnable, which usually means making them cleaner than they are in reality. That's the wrong instinct for this. The value is in the mess." Whitfield looked at him. "My operation has 43 maintenance professionals. About a third of them have been in the field long enough to have developed the kind of pattern recognition you're describing. The other 2/3 are technically qualified but haven't built it yet." He paused. "Could you accelerate the building of it through the curriculum?" "In some people, not all of them. The curriculum can shorten the timeline for people who have the underlying aptitude. It can't manufacture the aptitude." "How do you identify which ones have it?" Ethan thought about Roberto, about the specific moment in the hangar when Roberto had asked the question about the fault code cascade logic that was so precise it surprised everyone. You give them a problem that isn't in the manual and you watch what they do when they don't know. The ones who have it look for the pattern. The ones who don't look for authority. Someone to tell them the answer. Whitfield nodded slowly. "That's the same in piloting," he said. "We call it situational awareness, but that's a catch-all term for something more specific. The ones who have it are building a model of the system in their head at all times. The ones who don't are responding to discrete inputs." "Yes," Ethan said. "Exactly that." They talked for another 30 minutes. When Whitfield stood to leave, he said, "I want to bring you down to our operation in the spring. Spend a week. I'm not attaching anything to that. No offer, no expectation. I just want you to see what we're working with and tell me what you see." "A week is complicated," Ethan said. "I have a 6-year-old. "Bring her," Whitfield said, not facetiously. "We're on the coast. She'll like it." Ethan looked at him. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking." Whitfield paused at the door. "You know what I keep thinking about? Your memo from 2014, the E14 note. I pulled it after Angela mentioned it. You were right, it was clear, and the committee buried it in the notes section anyway." He shook his head slightly. "Bureaucratic momentum is a specific kind of force. It's not malicious, it's just heavy. It takes something to move it." "It takes the wrong thing happening," Ethan said. "Usually." "Usually," Whitfield agreed. "I'm glad the wrong thing happened to the right person this time." But he told Lily about the coast trip that evening, framing it as a possibility rather than a plan, because he'd learned that with Lily, the distance between possibility and plan collapsed very quickly once Gerald was involved. The coast, she said. She was doing the thing where she ate her dinner in a specific rotation: vegetables, protein, then whatever she'd designated as the treat component of the meal, which tonight was a bread roll she'd been eyeing since he'd put it on her plate. "Like the ocean?" "The ocean, yes." "Can Gerald come?" "It's not decided yet." She pointed her fork at him. "If we go and Gerald doesn't come, he'll be sad." "Gerald can come." "And can I see the planes?" "It's an aviation facility. There will be planes." She put the fork down and looked at him with the full weight of her attention, which was considerable. "I want to go," she said. "I thought you might." "When?" "Spring, maybe." "That's months away." She went back to her dinner, processing. "Months is a long time." "It passes." "Miss Patterson says that too." She ate a piece of broccoli with the air of someone getting obligations out of the way. "Does the airplane lady know you're doing all this now? The new job and the teaching and the Washington thing?" Ethan thought about the note on hotel stationery, the signed documents with Marcus's post-it. "She knows some of it." "Did you tell her thank you?" "She knows I appreciate what she did." Lily shook her head, with the specific disappointment of someone whose standards are being inadequately met. That's not the same as saying thank you. He looked at his daughter. She was right, which was increasingly the default state of things. I'll write her a note, he said. A real one, not a text. A real one. She picked up the bread roll, satisfied. Good. He wrote it that night after she was in bed. He sat at the kitchen table with the notepad he kept for grocery lists and wrote 3 drafts before settling on one that said what he meant, without saying more than he meant. Ms. Sterling, it read. I heard the deal closed. I'm glad. Since October, because of October, I've taken a part-time technical advisory position at Crestfield, begun developing curriculum for an aviation maintenance training institute, and been brought in as a consultant on an FAA supplement revision that I tried to get right 9 years ago and didn't have enough leverage to push through. I'm telling you this not to report back, but because you asked me to let you know what I did with the doors you opened. This is what I did with them. My daughter says to say thank you directly, because that's different from implying it. So, thank you. Directly. E.M. He addressed the envelope to Vivian Sterling, care of Sterling Dynamics, which was the only address he had for her, and put it on the counter to mail in the morning. He sat for a while after. The box from the closet was still on the kitchen table. He'd stopped moving it back, had just let it live there, had been pulling from it gradually over the past weeks as he needed reference material. The pressure systems theory folder was out, open to a section he'd been using for the Engstrom curriculum. The G700 Phase 2 folder was flagged with a post-it. The FAA Advisory Board session files were stacked beside it, the ones he'd need for the January Washington session. The box was not full of the past anymore, or rather, it was still full of the past. But the past had become useful again, had become material for the present rather than an archive of something over. That was a different relationship to have with it. He didn't think it would have happened on its own. He'd told Nora it might have, eventually, and he half believed it, but the half that didn't believe it knew that inertia is a specific kind of force, heavy in its own way, and that he'd been inside it for 5 years and might have stayed inside it for 5 more. The morning in October had moved something. A woman's urgent need and a pressure system's quiet failure, and a partial sightline through a gap in a door, and the accumulated weight of everything he knew pressing against the practiced invisibility he'd constructed, and the moment of decision, which hadn't felt like a moment of decision, but which he understood now to have been one. You couldn't always see the turning points while you were in them. Sometimes you could only see them from the other side, looking back at the specific morning where something that had been one thing became something else. December came. The FAA letter confirmed the January sessions. Engstrom sent the final curriculum framework for the first workshop, which was scheduled for February, and it was good, genuinely good, structured in the way Ethan had described, but with Engstrom's pedagogical instincts layered over it, which improved it in ways Ethan hadn't expected and was honest enough to say so. Whitfield sent a brief email confirming the spring visit as a standing invitation with no expiration date. Sandra renewed his advisory contract through June without being asked. Roberto passed his advanced diagnostics certification in early December. He sent Ethan a text that said, "Passed. Thank you for the foundation," short and direct, which was exactly Roberto's register, and Ethan replied, "You built it. I just pointed at the materials," which was true. That was what he was learning about teaching, the real version of it, not the performance of expertise, but the actual transfer of something. You couldn't give people what they didn't have the capacity to receive. What you could do was show them where to look and then get out of the way, and the getting out of the way was harder than it sounded. Lily lost her first tooth in December. She'd been monitoring its looseness for 2 weeks with scientific rigor, testing it every morning and reporting the results at breakfast. Looser, same, looser, but not enough. I think tomorrow. And then it came out on a Tuesday evening while she was eating an apple, and she appeared in the kitchen doorway holding it up between her fingers with an expression of pure vindicated triumph. "I told you it was almost," she said. "You told me," he confirmed. She examined it. "It's smaller than I thought." "They always are. Gerald wants to see it." She held it out toward the stuffed elephant, who was seated on the counter in a position of authority. He says it's a good one. Gerald has consistently good judgment. She closed her hand around the tooth and looked at Ethan with the particular look she got when she was about to say something she'd been composing for a while. Daddy, are you happy now? The question was so direct that it took him a moment. He thought about the checklist that was now in active use across 2 shifts at an aviation facility, preventing the kind of diagnostic error that he'd been the only person to catch correctly for 9 years. He thought about the curriculum case study, the anonymized Tuesday morning being read right now by Paul Engstrom, and being turned into a teaching tool for maintenance professionals across the country who would never know his name but would have better frameworks because of his work. He thought about the Washington sessions in January, the FAA supplement that was finally going to be corrected, the red circle from 2014 becoming a formal fix in 2025 after 9 years of being buried in the notes. He thought about the Honda with the dent above the rear wheel arch. He thought about the refrigerator list, necessary, 2 S's. He thought about Gerald on the counter with his slightly worried expression and his asymmetric ears. He thought about Claire, who had understood people in a way he never quite had, and who had given him this daughter who somehow understood both people and things, who said, "I would share you with the airplanes if that helped," and meant it, who made flashcards for her classmates and named her stuffed elephant Gerald, and faced the prospect of being wrong in a classroom by saying the answer anyway, because if she didn't say it, she'd never know. "Yeah," he said, "I am." She nodded, satisfied, and unclosed her hand to look at the tooth again. "Me too," she said, and went to put the tooth somewhere Gerald could keep an eye on it. He drove to Crestfield on the 2nd Tuesday of December. A regular work day, nothing distinctive about it scheduled. He had the Engstrom materials to review and a meeting with Sandra about the second phase of the checklist project, which was expanding to cover the Bombardier series in addition to the G700. He had a call with Angela Reyes at 2 about the January logistics. He parked in his spot, which had a parking pass now, consultant in the same font as the badge, and walked through the employee entrance and up to the 2nd floor. The office smelled like coffee and old paper, and faintly less like boxes than it used to. He sat down and opened the laptop. Outside his window, on the hangar floor, the morning operations were in full motion. A charter aircraft was being prepped for departure at Bay 2. Ground crew moved with the particular choreography of people who know the routine, each person's movement accounting for where the others will be, the kind of coordination that only comes from repetition and trust. He watched it for a moment. He'd watched this floor for 5 months from inside a utility corridor, from the angle of someone moving through a space without being part of it. That was a specific kind of watching, observant but detached, taking in the shape of things without being inside the shape. He was inside it now, or closer to it, and the view was different in ways he was still cataloging. He thought about what Vivian Sterling had said on the phone. The aviation industry lost something when you walked away from it. He'd thought about that sentence a number of times since October, not with the pleasure of flattery, but with the more complicated feeling of examining a statement you're not sure you fully believe and not sure you can fully dismiss. He hadn't walked away from it because he'd failed. That was the thing he'd never quite said clearly, not to anyone. He hadn't been pushed out or burned out or outmaneuvered. He'd been, at the time he left, one of the better engineers in his field. And he'd known it, and he'd left anyway because the field had stopped being the most important thing, and he'd had to choose. For a long time, he'd framed that as a sacrifice, a clean trade, career for family, expertise for presence. The framing had been useful because it was simple, because it gave the decision a shape that was easy to carry. But simple framings are often incomplete, and he'd known for a while, in the way you know things you're not quite ready to say, that sacrifice wasn't the right word for it. He'd chosen his daughter. That was accurate. But the industry had lost something was also accurate, and the two things could coexist. The right choice and the loss were both real, neither canceling the other. He'd given up something that mattered to be somewhere that mattered more, and the mattering of both things didn't diminish because of the choice. What he hadn't expected, and what October had made clear, was that the choice didn't have to be permanent. The version of it that was permanent, the version he'd built, with the gray uniform and the institutional cleaner and the practiced invisibility, that version had been a kind of overcorrection. He could see it now from the outside. He'd made himself small enough to ensure the family was protected, and he'd stayed small past the point where it was necessary because staying small had become the shape of his life, and it was easier to maintain a shape than to question it. The Tuesday morning in October had questioned it for him, which was, in its way, what he'd needed. He was reading the Engstrom materials when his phone buzzed, a number he didn't immediately recognize, though the area code was familiar. He answered. "Mr. Mercer," a woman's voice, slightly formal. "My name is Helen Park. I'm the executive director of the Aviation Safety Institute. I've been speaking with Angela Reyes and James Whitfield over the past several weeks, and your name has come up in both conversations, independently, which tends to get my attention." He set down his pen. "All right. I'll be direct, because I understand that's your preference." She said it without irony, which meant Angela or Whitfield had briefed her reasonably well. "We're building a practitioner's advisory panel for a multi-year diagnostic standards initiative. The goal is to develop a cross-fleet framework for fault code presentation analysis, something that can be adapted for use by maintenance facilities across aircraft series. The panel would include a mix of field engineers, regulatory specialists, and academic researchers." A pause. "We'd like you to consider a seat on it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What's the time commitment?" he said. 4 sessions per year. 2 in person, 2 remote. Plus review work between sessions. We'd estimate 10 to 15 hours quarterly. We understand people have primary professional commitments, and we design the schedule accordingly. "I have a 6-year-old daughter," he said. "My schedule is—" "Mr. Whitfield mentioned your daughter," she said. "He said she wants to fix airplanes when she grows up." Ethan looked at the window. He remembered that. He seemed to find it relevant. He said, and I'm quoting him, "If her father can develop the next generation of diagnostic standards while also raising someone who already understands the problem at age 6, the panel should be so lucky." He sat with that for a moment. "Send me the formal proposal," he said. "I'll read it carefully before I give you an answer." "That's what I expected you to say," she said. "I'll send it today." He put the phone down on the desk and looked at it. He thought about the configuration Sandra had mentioned, how it takes as long as it takes to find it. He thought about the post-it in the drawer, Marcus's handwriting. She thought you might want proof it worked. He thought about the red circle in the margin of a 2014 draft procedure. He thought about the checklist that Roberto was now teaching. He thought about the January Washington sessions and the February workshop, and the coast in spring if Lily agreed. And she would agree, because the coast meant ocean and plains and Gerald in the car for a long drive, all of which she would consider optimal. He thought about the box on the kitchen table, still open, its contents in active use. He picked up his pen and went back to the Engstrom materials. He picked Lily up at 3:15, the same as always. She was in the outdoor area today, which she preferred to indoors on the grounds that there was more to see outside, a reasonable position. She was at the far end of the play structure, talking to another child with the focused intensity she brought to all significant conversations, and she didn't see him immediately when he came through the gate. He stood there for a moment and watched her without calling out. She was wearing the red coat, the one that was already slightly too small, but that she refused to replace on the grounds that she liked it, and she had Gerald tucked under one arm in the crook of her elbow, leaving the other hand free for gesturing, which she was doing while making what appeared to be a point about something. The child she was talking to, a boy he didn't recognize, was nodding with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving more information than they'd anticipated. He watched his daughter explain something to a stranger with complete confidence and total investment, and he thought about all the versions of this morning he might have been standing in, all the alternate configurations that might have existed if the G700 had never developed a thermal calibration drift, if he'd never had a sightline through that gap in the door, if he'd managed to convince himself that it wasn't his problem and walked past. He thought about how much of life was exactly that. The sightline you happen to have, the gap you happen to pass, the specific accumulation of everything you knew pressing against the moment in a way that made it impossible, finally, to keep walking. He wasn't a person who believed that things happened for reasons. He was an engineer. He believed that systems behaved according to their parameters, and that outcomes were the product of conditions and choices, and that the word inevitable was almost always applied retrospectively to things that were, at the time, just possible. The Tuesday morning in October had been possible. He'd made it actual. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. "Daddy." Lily had spotted him. She extracted herself from the conversation, saying something quick to the boy that made him nod, and then apparently giving Gerald a brief instruction, and walked toward the gate with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows the person waiting isn't going anywhere. She came through the gate and took his hand. "How was your day?" she said. She'd been asking this for about 3 months, having apparently decided she was old enough to ask it, and she meant it genuinely, which he found genuinely moving every time. "Good," he said. "Busy. Someone might want me to join a panel." "What kind of panel?" "A group of people who work together to make aircraft maintenance better." She considered this while they walked to the car. "Like a team. Like a team." "Teams are good," she said. "Better than doing things alone." "Usually." "Miss Patterson says 2 heads are better than 1. She opened the back door and settled in with the practiced efficiency she brought to the car routine. "But she also says sometimes one person has to make the call, which is different." "That's also true." "So which is it?" He got in the driver's seat and looked at her in the rear view. "Both," he said, "at different moments. The skill is knowing which moment you're in." She thought about that with visible effort, then said, "Okay," in the tone that meant she'd filed it for later consideration. He pulled out of the parking lot. They drove for a block in comfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that exists between people who have no need to fill it. The afternoon light was the short, flat light of December, lying low across everything. "Gerald wants waffles," Lily said. "It's Tuesday." "He knows. He's asking anyway." Ethan thought about the checklist on the Crestfield server, about the case study Engstrom was reading, about the Washington hotel reserved for January, the coast in spring, the advisory panel proposal coming to his email sometime today, about the note on the counter, addressed and waiting to be mailed, with its direct thank you to a woman he'd met once in a hangar at 5 in the morning and wouldn't have known at all if a pressure system hadn't quietly failed in the night. He thought about how none of it was finished, how the checklist would need updates as new fault presentations emerged, how the curriculum would need iteration after the first workshop revealed what the workshop actually needed to be, how the FAA supplement would get revised and then need revision again in 10 years, when something else turned out to have been documented incorrectly, how Lily would change every year, would become someone he could barely predict from the 6-year-old in the back seat, would ask harder questions and need different things, and make her own choices that he could influence but couldn't control. How none of it was a destination, it was just the work. The ongoing, renewable, never fully resolved work of being competent and present and honest about both the things you know and the things you don't. Of staying in the room when the room is hard. Of saying the answer even when you're not certain, because if you don't say it, you'll never know. He thought about Claire, who had known that better than him and had tried to teach it to him in the years they'd had, and about the daughter in the back seat who had arrived at the same knowledge on her own and was now teaching it back to him without knowing that was what she was doing. "We'll do waffles," he said. Lily relayed this to Gerald with satisfaction. "He says thank you," she reported. "Tell him he's welcome," she murmured to Gerald, then, "He says you're his favorite person." "I thought that was you." "He has 2 favorites." She looked at him in the mirror with the expression that was her mother's expression, the slightly skeptical, entirely warm look that he had loved in one person and now loved in another, across a distance and a silence he'd learned to carry. "Is that okay?" He thought about everything the word okay was trying to hold. "Yeah," he said. "That's okay." He drove them home through the early December dark, and the heater ran the way it always ran, and Lily talked to Gerald in the quiet voice she used when she was telling him things she wasn't quite ready to say out loud to anyone else. And Ethan listened to the sound of it without trying to hear the words. Some things were private. Some things were just between a girl and her elephant, conducted in the warm back seat of an ordinary car on an ordinary street in a life that had, quietly and without ceremony, become exactly what it was supposed to be. Not perfect, never perfect, but his. Fully, finally, and without apology. His.